You've been taught that choosing yourself is selfish, that putting your needs first makes you cold, uncaring, difficult, that if you stop giving, stop fixing, stop showing up for everyone, you will lose love, respect, belonging. But if that were true, why are so many kind people exhausted? Why do those who give the most feel the most empty? Why do you feel tired even when you're doing the right thing? Why does your heart feel heavy when your life looks fine from the outside? The truth is, choosing yourself is not abandonment, it is repair. It is the moment you stop bleeding silently and start listening to what your pain has been trying to say. Buddhist wisdom has taught this for thousands of years. Suffering does not come from letting go. It comes from clinging to roles, clinging to approval, clinging to the idea that your worth comes from how much you endure. The Buddha never asked you to disappear for others. He taught you to wake up to yourself, to see clearly, to release what drains your life force, and to return to balance. As you listen, something will begin to soften. The tightness in your chest will loosen. The guilt will start to lose its grip. The constant need to explain yourself will fade. You may notice your breath slow down, your thoughts become quieter, your body remembering what safety feels like. This is not about becoming selfish. This is about becoming whole. This is not about pushing people away. This is about stopping the habit of leaving yourself behind. This is not just a teaching to listen to. It is a remembering waiting to happen. Are you ready? Let's begin. Something has already shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the way the body responds when pressure is finally released. The words you just heard were not meant to persuade you. They were meant to touch something familiar, something you have lived with for a long time, but rarely named. Now the movement continues gently, because the next understanding does not arrive through force. It arrives through attention. There is a form of harm that is rarely recognized because it leaves no obvious damage. It does not bruise the skin or break bones. It often looks responsible, generous, even noble. Yet over time it creates deep psychological suffering. This harm happens when you consistently turn away from your own inner truth, when you silence your needs, override your limits, and ignore what your body and emotions are clearly communicating. This is the subtle violence of self-abandonment. Most people are taught to believe that suffering comes from difficult events, from other people, from circumstances beyond control. Buddhism offers a more precise view. It teaches that suffering intensifies when awareness is lost. When you stop listening to your direct experience, when you deny what is happening inside you, confusion grows. And confusion, not pain itself, is what binds suffering to the mind. Self-abandonment rarely begins as a conscious choice. It often starts as adaptation. At some point, usually early in life, you learn that certain feelings are inconvenient, that expressing discomfort creates tension, that saying no risks rejection, so you adjust. You become skilled at reading others while becoming disconnected from yourself. You learn how to endure rather than respond. This adaptation may help you belong, but it comes at a quiet cost. Psychologically, ignoring inner truth creates internal conflict. The mind continues to function, to plan, to perform, while the emotional system carries unresolved signals. The body holds what the mind dismisses. Tension becomes chronic, fatigue becomes familiar, emotional flatness replaces joy. These are not random symptoms. They are messages from a system that has been asked to remain silent for too long. Buddhism does not treat this pattern as harmless. Turning away from your own experience is seen as a form of harm because it deepens ignorance. Not ignorance of facts, but ignorance of reality as it is being lived. When you invalidate your own feelings, you distort perception. And when perception is distorted, actions follow that distortion. This is how suffering repeats itself, not because life is cruel, but because clarity is avoided. Many people stay in situations that erode them because they confuse endurance with virtue. They believe leaving would be selfish, unkind, disloyal. Buddhist teaching gently dismantles this belief. It explains that clinging to identities, roles, and expectations is one of the primary sources of suffering. When you remain where you are diminished out of fear or obligation, you are not practicing compassion. You are practicing attachment. Over time, self-abandonment reshapes how you think. You begin to doubt your instincts. You minimize your reactions. You create explanations to override your own discomfort. It's not that serious. I should be grateful. This is just how relationships work. These thoughts sound reasonable, but they disconnect you from truth. Buddhism teaches that wisdom does not come from rationalizing pain. It comes from meeting it with awareness. As awareness is suppressed, suffering becomes layered. There is the original pain, and then there is the isolation of carrying it alone. This creates a sense of loneliness that cannot be solved by company. You may be surrounded by people and still feel unseen because you have learned to hide the parts of yourself that are struggling. This hiddenness slowly turns into resentment, not always directed outward, but inward, toward your own life. The mind often responds by staying busy. Constant activity becomes a way to avoid stillness. Helping others becomes a way to avoid listening to yourself. Productivity replaces presence. Buddhism recognizes this pattern without judgment. It simply points out that what is avoided does not disappear. It waits, gathering strength, until it must be acknowledged. Self-abandonment also affects relationships. When you ignore your own limits, you teach others to do the same. When you do not express your needs, you expect them to be sensed. When they are not, disappointment grows quietly. This creates cycles of misunderstanding that reinforce the belief that your needs are unreasonable. In reality, they were never given space to exist. Buddhism emphasizes right relationship, and this includes the relationship with yourself. Right relationship begins with listening, not analyzing, not fixing, not suppressing. Listening to the body when it tightens. Listening to emotions when they signal withdrawal. Listening to fatigue when it asks for rest. These signals are not obstacles to growth, they are guides. Ignoring them is like ignoring pain in an injured limb. The damage increases not because it is severe, but because it is unattended. There is also a spiritual consequence to self-abandonment. When you live out of alignment with your inner truth, energy becomes fragmented. A part of you is always managing, compensating, performing. This leaves little room for clarity or ease. You may seek insight, practice meditation, study teachings, yet feel unchanged. Buddhism would say that insight cannot stabilize where honesty is absent. Awakening is not built on self-denial, it is built on direct knowing. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from not seeing clearly. Self-abandonment is a refusal to see your own experience as real. It is choosing a story over sensation, expectation over truth. Over time, this creates disorientation. You may feel lost without knowing when it began. The loss did not happen suddenly. It occurred gradually, each time you chose silence over authenticity. Healing begins the moment you stop arguing with your own experience, when you allow yourself to acknowledge discomfort without explaining it away. Buddhism calls this right mindfulness. It is the simple act of staying present with what is happening now. From this presence, compassion arises naturally, not the kind that sacrifices the self, but the kind that includes it. Choosing to listen inwardly may initially feel unsettling. Guilt may surface, fear may arise, long-held habits resist change. Buddhism does not interpret this resistance as failure. It understands it as attachment responding to threat. Discomfort is not a signal to retreat. It is a signal that awareness is returning. As self-abandonment loosens, subtle changes appear. The nervous system begins to settle, decisions feel less forced. You stop explaining yourself away. You begin to trust your inner responses again. This trust is not ego, it is alignment. And alignment reduces suffering not only within you, but in the space you share with others. A person who honors their inner truth brings clarity rather than confusion into relationships. Self-abandonment was never a personal flaw. It was a strategy shaped by context, a way to stay safe, connected, accepted. Buddhism does not condemn strategies that once served survival. It simply invites their release when they no longer serve awakening. Letting go is not loss. It is space. Space for honesty. Space for balance. Space for a life that does not require you to disappear in order to continue. As this understanding deepens, the way you view your past may soften, not with regret, but with recognition. You endured because you believed endurance was necessary. You stayed quiet because you believed silence was kindness. Seeing this clearly is not self-blame, it is the beginning of truth. Something begins to surface once you stop turning away from yourself. Not relief yet, not certainty, but awareness. Awareness of how often your kindness has been stretched beyond what feels natural. Awareness of how care has slowly turned into obligation. Awareness of the quiet weight carried by those who give without pause. This awareness does not accuse, it simply stays. Compassion has a strong emotional pull. It creates connection, it gives meaning, it makes suffering feel useful. But when compassion is offered without limits, its nature changes. What once felt open begins to feel heavy. What once felt loving begins to feel draining. Buddhism speaks directly to this shift because it understands that not all giving is free. Some giving is shaped by fear, some by longing, some by the need to be seen and valued. In Buddhist teaching, true compassion arises from clarity. It comes from seeing suffering clearly without becoming entangled in it. When boundaries are absent, compassion loses this clarity. It becomes personal. It becomes emotional labor. It becomes a way to manage inner discomfort rather than a response to what is actually needed. Overgiving often appears generous, but beneath it, there is often a quiet craving for reassurance, appreciation, or belonging. This pattern usually forms early. When care is inconsistent, giving becomes protection. Being helpful feels safer than being honest. Being needed feels safer than being vulnerable. Over time, you learn that your value comes from what you provide. Buddhism names this attachment. Not attachment to people themselves, but attachment to the feeling of being important to others. When compassion is mixed with attachment, it is no longer light. You give, but you also wait. You notice reactions. You feel unsettled when effort goes unrecognized. You feel hurt when closeness fades. This emotional instability is not proof that you care deeply. It is proof that giving has become tied to self-worth. Buddhism teaches that whenever peace depends on outcomes, suffering follows. Craving is described in Buddhism as the root of suffering. It does not only seek pleasure, it seeks security, it seeks identity, it seeks control. Overgiving can be driven by the craving to be indispensable. When helping others becomes the primary way you feel stable, compassion turns into a subtle transaction. Even when nothing is asked for directly, something is hoped for quietly. This creates exhaustion that rest cannot fix. Emotional fatigue builds because energy is constantly flowing outward. There is little space for reflection, little room for replenishment. Buddhism explains that this imbalance leads to dukkha, a sense of unease that lingers beneath daily life. Giving without boundaries drains the heart because it asks it to function without protection. Boundaries are not walls, they are awareness in action. Buddhism sees boundaries as a form of wisdom. They define where responsibility ends. Without them, compassion becomes confused. You begin to take on emotions that are not yours. You feel responsible for outcomes you cannot control. This confusion deepens suffering rather than relieving it. When boundaries are absent, relationships shift in subtle ways. You may feel trapped by roles you once chose freely. Others may come to rely on you in ways that limit their own growth. This imbalance prevents genuine connection. Buddhism teaches that compassion should support liberation, not dependency. When one person carries too much, both remain bound. Internally, attachment-driven compassion pulls attention away from the present moment. You monitor reactions, you anticipate needs, you adjust behavior to maintain harmony. This creates anxiety. Your inner state becomes dependent on external responses. Buddhism calls this living in conditions rather than in awareness. Peace becomes fragile because it relies on factors outside your control. True compassion does not require self-erasure. It allows care without self-neglect. It makes room for refusal without guilt. Buddhism teaches that compassion grounded in wisdom knows when to step forward and when to step back. Saying no does not end love. It clarifies it. When boundaries are introduced, guilt often appears. This does not mean you are doing harm. Buddhism understands guilt as a conditioned response that arises when old patterns are disrupted. If your identity has been built around giving, limits feel like betrayal. But what is being challenged is not kindness. It is attachment to a role. Overgiving can also serve as avoidance. Focusing on others keeps attention away from unresolved inner experiences. Helping becomes a way to stay busy. Buddhism points to this gently. When compassion is used to escape self-awareness, it delays healing. The body may move, but the heart remains stuck. Another layer of attachment is control. When you invest heavily in others, there may be an unspoken desire for stability, for predictability, for consistency. Buddhism teaches that this resistance to impermanence creates suffering. People change, needs shift, roles dissolve. Compassion without boundaries struggles to accept this truth. Boundaries restore balance. They allow compassion to remain fluid without becoming heavy. Buddhism emphasizes the middle path, not extremes, neither self-sacrifice nor self-absorption. Boundaries are where care and clarity meet. As boundaries strengthen, compassion becomes quieter, less reactive, more grounded. You stop rescuing, you stop managing emotions that are not yours. You trust others to meet their own experiences. This does not reduce love, it refines it. There may be discomfort as identity adjusts. Feeling less needed can feel like loss. Buddhism sees this as ego loosening. When attachment weakens, fear surfaces briefly. But what follows is steadiness, a form of peace that does not depend on being central. Compassion with boundaries protects energy. Presence deepens, resentment fades. Help becomes intentional rather than compulsive. Buddhism teaches that intention shapes experience. Giving from fullness spreads ease. Giving from depletion spreads strain. Something subtle tightens when this truth comes closer. Not fear exactly, but recognition. A quiet knowing that some places you stayed were never meant to be permanent. That some roles you kept playing slowly erased parts of you. This is where the next layer opens, not with blame, but with consequence. There is a belief that staying, even when it hurts, is harmless. That endurance is neutral. That remaining silent only affects the present moment. Buddhism sees it differently. It teaches that every choice leaves a trace, not as punishment, but as momentum. When you stay where you are diminished, something accumulates. Not only memory, but karmic residue. Karma is often misunderstood. It is not fate. It is not reward or punishment. It is pattern. It is the momentum created by repeated action and intention. Each time you remain in a role that requires you to shrink, you reinforce a message within the mind and body. You teach yourself what to tolerate. You teach the nervous system what is normal. Over time, this becomes a default setting. Staying in harmful roles does not just affect how you feel in the moment, it shapes how you relate in the future. Buddhism explains that karma conditions perception. When you repeatedly abandon yourself, the mind begins to expect abandonment. You may find yourself drawn to similar dynamics again and again, not because you want pain, but because the pattern feels familiar. This is how karmic residue works. It is not about blame, it is about continuity. The mind learns through repetition. When staying diminished becomes habitual, it becomes identity. You start to see yourself as the one who adapts, who endures, who holds everything together. This identity then filters choices, relationships, and even opportunities. There is also an energetic cost. Buddhism teaches that intention matters as much as action. When you stay out of fear, obligation, or guilt, that intention leaves a mark. The body remembers. The mind carries tension forward. Even when circumstances change, the internal posture remains the same. You may leave one harmful situation only to recreate another with different faces. Staying diminished also distorts compassion. You may begin to confuse suffering with virtue. You tell yourself that pain is part of love, that sacrifice is proof of goodness. Buddhism challenges this deeply. It teaches that suffering does not purify by itself. Awareness does. Endurance without clarity only deepens confusion. Karmic residue builds when awareness is ignored. Each time your inner voice signals discomfort and you override it, the signal weakens. This does not mean the truth disappears. It means it goes underground. Over time, this creates disconnection. You may feel less alive, less clear, less present. This is not aging, it is accumulation. Buddhism also teaches that karma influences rebirth, not only in a literal sense, but in the rebirth of patterns. Each new relationship is a continuation of previous conditioning unless something interrupts it. When you stay in roles that harm you, you carry that conditioning forward. You may attract situations where your boundaries are tested again, where your needs are overlooked again, where your voice feels secondary again. This does not mean you deserve it. It means the pattern has not yet been seen clearly enough to dissolve. Karma persists until awareness enters. Awareness interrupts momentum. It creates choice where there was habit. There is a common fear that leaving harmful roles creates bad karma. Buddhism teaches the opposite. Staying in harm out of fear creates entanglement. Leaving with clarity creates release. Karma is shaped by intention. Leaving with anger binds. Leaving with awareness frees. Remaining where you are diminished also affects how you see others. You may normalize harmful behavior. You may excuse what should not be excused. This dulls discernment. Buddhism places great importance on wisdom, the ability to see clearly what leads to suffering and what leads away from it. When you stay too long in harm, clarity erodes. The body often understands before the mind does. Chronic tension, fatigue, numbness, anxiety are not random. They are signals that something is misaligned. Buddhism teaches that ignoring these signals is a form of ignorance, not moral ignorance, but experiential ignorance. When the body is ignored, karma accumulates faster because awareness is bypassed. Staying diminished also affects self-trust. Each time you ignore your own knowing, trust weakens. Decisions become harder, doubt increases. You may seek external validation for choices you once felt clearly. This dependency is karmic residue. It follows you until it is addressed. There is also grief hidden in staying. Grief for the life not lived. Grief for the version of yourself that could have emerged. Buddhism recognizes regret as a form of suffering that arises when inner wisdom is ignored. This grief may not be conscious, but it colors experience. It can appear as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a vague sense of loss. Karma is not fixed. Buddhism emphasizes this again and again. The moment awareness returns, momentum changes. Seeing the cost of staying clearly is already transformation. You cannot unknow what you now see. This seeing weakens the pattern. Leaving harmful roles does not require drama, it requires honesty. Sometimes leaving is physical, sometimes it is emotional, sometimes it is the internal decision to stop participating in a dynamic even if circumstances remain. Buddhism teaches that intention is powerful. A clear intention begins to dissolve residue. There is often fear of consequences, fear of hurting others, fear of being judged, fear of uncertainty. Buddhism acknowledges fear as natural. It does not treat fear as a stop sign, it treats it as information. Fear often arises when attachment is challenged. This does not mean the choice is wrong, it means something old is loosening. Staying diminished out of loyalty also creates karma. Loyalty without wisdom binds. Buddhism values compassion, but it also values discernment. Compassion that requires self-erasure is not liberating. It perpetuates suffering across time. When you remain in harm, you also teach others how to treat you. This is not blame. It is pattern formation. Repeated tolerance becomes expectation. Buddhism teaches that right action includes protecting the conditions for awakening. Staying where awareness is constantly suppressed does the opposite. There is a subtle sense of relief that comes when this is understood. Not relief that erases pain, but relief that names it. You were not weak for staying. You were conditioned, and conditioning can be changed. Karmic residue also shows up in the stories you tell yourself. Stories of limitation, stories of unworthiness, stories of inevitability. Buddhism teaches that these stories are not self, they are mental formations shaped by experience. Seeing them as conditioned loosens their hold. Breaking karmic patterns requires patience. The mind may pull you back toward familiarity. This is not failure, it is momentum adjusting. Each time you choose awareness over habit, the residue thins. The pattern weakens. Staying diminished often feels easier in the short term. Leaving feels uncertain. Buddhism teaches that short-term comfort often leads to long-term suffering, while short-term discomfort can lead to freedom. This is not a rule, but an observation. As clarity grows, responsibility shifts. Not responsibility for others' feelings, but responsibility for your own alignment. This responsibility is not heavy. It is grounding. It brings you back into your life. The recognition of karmic residue does not demand immediate action. It asks for honesty. It asks you to see staying clearly, without justification, without condemnation. This seeing alone begins to change the future. Something loosens when you finally see the cost of staying. Not relief yet, but clarity. A quiet recognition that endurance alone was never wisdom. That remaining small required a story to survive, and that story often sounded like goodness. This is where the next layer unfolds, gently but firmly, touching something many people protect without realizing how heavy it has become. There is a version of you that learned to be good in order to be safe. Not good in a moral sense, but good in a relational one. The one who does not cause trouble, the one who understands. The one who forgives quickly, the one who holds everything together. This identity often forms early, shaped by environments where approval mattered more than authenticity. Over time, it becomes a role you inhabit without questioning. Being the good one feels comforting. It gives structure. It provides certainty about who you are in the eyes of others. It creates a sense of worth that feels stable. But Buddhism invites a closer look. It asks whether this goodness is arising from awareness or from attachment, because when goodness becomes identity, it quietly turns into ego. Ego in Buddhism is not arrogance, it is identification. It is the moment you mistake a role for the self. When goodness becomes who you are rather than how you respond, it hardens. You begin to protect it. You avoid anything that might threaten it. Anger becomes dangerous. Boundaries feel selfish. Disagreement feels like failure. This is not freedom. It is confinement disguised as virtue. Identity-based goodness often requires suppression. You learn to swallow reactions that do not fit the image. You silence resentment. You explain away hurt. You tell yourself that being good means being above such feelings. But the body does not forget what the mind dismisses. Suppressed emotions do not dissolve. They accumulate, turning inward as tension, fatigue, or quiet bitterness. Buddhism teaches that clinging to identity creates suffering because identity resists impermanence. The world changes, people change, you change, but the identity of being the good one demands consistency. It asks you to respond the same way even when circumstances call for something different. This rigidity creates internal conflict. You feel one thing but perform another. There is also a subtle superiority hidden in this identity, not conscious, not cruel, but present. When you see yourself as the good one, others become the difficult ones, the needy ones, the ones who don't try hard enough. This creates separation. Buddhism teaches that true compassion dissolves separation. Identity-based goodness reinforces it. Being the good one can also become a shield against rejection. If you are always kind, always understanding, always accommodating, it feels less likely that others will leave. Goodness becomes insurance. But this is attachment, not love. It binds your worth to behavior. It makes acceptance conditional on performance. Over time, this creates exhaustion, not because goodness is draining, but because maintaining an identity requires constant monitoring. You watch yourself, you edit reactions, you manage impressions. This vigilance consumes energy. Buddhism would say that peace cannot arise where effort is spent protecting an image. Another cost is the loss of honesty. When you are invested in being good, truth becomes risky. Saying no feels like betrayal. Expressing anger feels wrong. Naming disappointment feels unkind. But Buddhism teaches that truth is not opposed to compassion. Avoiding truth is what creates harm. When honesty is sacrificed to maintain goodness, relationships become shallow. Letting go of being the good one does not mean becoming careless or cruel. It means releasing the attachment to an image. It means allowing responses to arise from awareness rather than from fear of losing approval. This is a profound act of healing because it reunites you with parts of yourself that were exiled in the name of goodness. There is often fear around this release. Fear of becoming selfish, fear of hurting others, fear of losing identity altogether. Buddhism understands this fear as the ego sensing change. When identification loosens, uncertainty appears. But this uncertainty is fertile. It allows something more authentic to grow. Without the need to be good, you become real. You can be kind and firm, caring and honest, compassionate and clear. Buddhism calls this wisdom. Wisdom does not follow rules blindly. It responds to what is present. Sometimes that response is softness. Sometimes it is distance. Both can arise from care. Identity-based goodness also limits growth. When you are attached to being good, mistakes feel intolerable. You may avoid risks that could lead to learning. You may stay silent when something needs to be challenged. Buddhism teaches that awakening requires willingness to see one's own conditioning. Identity resists this seeing because it wants to remain intact. There is also grief in letting go. Grief for the recognition you hoped for. Grief for the approval you worked hard to earn. Buddhism does not rush this grief. It allows it to be felt, because beneath it is relief. Relief from having to hold everything together. Relief from being responsible for everyone's comfort. As the identity loosens, relationships shift. Some deepen, some fade. This is not punishment, it is alignment. When you stop performing goodness, you invite others to meet you honestly. Not everyone will. Buddhism teaches that this is part of impermanence. What falls away was held together by role, not by truth. Letting go of being the good one also restores self-trust. You begin to listen inwardly again. You respond rather than react. You stop asking who you should be and start noticing what is needed. This simplicity is healing. It reduces inner conflict. It creates coherence between thought, feeling, and action. There is a quiet strength that emerges here, not the strength of endurance, but the strength of presence. You no longer need to justify yourself. You no longer need to be understood by everyone. Buddhism teaches that freedom arises when you stop trying to control how you are perceived. This does not mean abandoning ethics. Buddhism is clear about right action, but right action arises from clarity, not from identity. When goodness is no longer something you are, it becomes something you do naturally, without effort, without self-reference. Something settles after releasing the need to be good. Not energy yet, not relief, but honesty. An honesty that notices how tired you really are, how long you've been carrying more than your share, how often your body spoke and your mind answered with discipline instead of care. This is where the next understanding opens, not as a diagnosis, but as a message you were never taught how to hear. There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep does not touch. Rest helps the body, but something deeper remains depleted. This exhaustion shows up as heaviness in the chest, fog in the mind, irritation without cause, a sense of being emotionally offline. Many people label this as weakness, laziness, or failure. Buddhism sees it differently. It sees emotional exhaustion as communication, a signal from the body-mind that something is misaligned. Burnout is often treated as a personal flaw, as if you simply didn't manage better, didn't try hard enough, didn't stay positive. But Buddhism does not shame exhaustion. It asks what has been ignored. Because burnout does not arise from effort alone, it arises from effort that is disconnected from truth. When you live out of alignment with your inner reality for too long, the system compensates. You override fatigue. You push past discomfort. You silence emotional signals. At first, this seems possible. You function, you perform, but the cost accumulates. The nervous system remains activated. The body stays in a state of readiness. Over time, it cannot sustain this state. Exhaustion appears not as collapse, but as protection. Buddhism teaches that the body and mind are not separate. What the mind avoids, the body expresses. When emotions are not allowed space, they find other channels. Tension becomes chronic. Motivation fades. Joy feels distant. These are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are signs that something important has been ignored for too long. Emotional exhaustion often follows prolonged self-betrayal, staying in roles that require suppression, giving beyond capacity, maintaining identities that no longer fit. The body does not measure morality, it measures truth. When your actions repeatedly contradict your inner signals, the system eventually slows you down. This slowing is not punishment, it is recalibration. In Buddhism, suffering is a teacher, not because pain is good, but because it points to imbalance. Burnout is a form of suffering that asks for attention, not to be fixed quickly, but to be understood. It asks you to look at how you are living, not just what you are doing. Many people respond to burnout by trying harder, more discipline, more productivity, more self-improvement. Buddhism would say this deepens the problem. You cannot resolve misalignment with more force. Alignment requires listening. It requires stillness. It requires the courage to stop long enough to feel what you have been avoiding. Emotional exhaustion also challenges the belief that worth comes from output. When energy drops, identity shakes. You may feel useless, unmotivated, disconnected from purpose. Buddhism teaches that this identity is conditional. It was built on doing, not being. Burnout strips this illusion away, leaving you face to face with a deeper question. Who are you when you are no longer producing? This question is uncomfortable. It exposes how much of life was driven by obligation rather than intention. How often rest was earned rather than respected. Buddhism invites a different view. Rest is not a reward, it is a requirement for clarity. Burnout also affects perception. The world may feel dull, relationships feel demanding, small tasks feel overwhelming. This is not because life suddenly became harder, it is because the system no longer has surplus energy to compensate. Buddhism teaches that when energy is low, mindfulness becomes even more important. Not mindfulness as effort, but as gentle awareness. Emotional exhaustion is also linked to unresolved grief. Grief for unmet needs, grief for suppressed desires, grief for years spent performing instead of living. This grief may not have words. It may show up as emptiness or sadness without a clear story. Buddhism allows this grief to exist without rushing it away. It sees grief as a natural response to truth returning. There is also anger beneath burnout. Not explosive anger, but quiet resentment. Resentment at being overlooked, at being taken for granted, at taking care of everyone else while neglecting yourself. Buddhism does not judge this anger. It sees it as information. Anger points to violated boundaries. When boundaries are ignored long enough, anger turns inward as exhaustion. Burnout is also a signal that the nervous system needs safety. Constant vigilance, people-pleasing, emotional monitoring keep the system in a state of alert. Over time, this leads to collapse. Buddhism teaches that safety is essential for awareness. Without safety, the mind contracts. Healing begins when the system is allowed to rest without guilt. Many people fear that listening to exhaustion means giving up, that slowing down means falling behind. Buddhism reframes this. It teaches that slowing down is how wisdom catches up. When you stop forcing, clarity has space to emerge. Emotional exhaustion also reveals misdirected compassion. When care flows outward without replenishment, the source dries up. Buddhism emphasizes balance. Compassion includes the self. When the self is excluded, compassion becomes distortion. Burnout is the correction. There is often shame around exhaustion. Shame for needing rest. Shame for not coping better. Buddhism sees shame as another layer of suffering. It obscures understanding. Exhaustion is not a moral failure. It is a biological and psychological response to prolonged misalignment. Listening to burnout requires patience. The mind wants quick solutions. The body asks for presence. Buddhism teaches that healing is not linear. Some days energy returns. Some days it does not. The practice is not to judge these fluctuations, but to stay attentive. As alignment slowly returns, subtle changes appear. Sleep deepens, breath softens, thoughts slow. These are not achievements. They are signs that the system is no longer under constant strain. Buddhism values these signs because they indicate reduced suffering. Burnout also invites a re-evaluation of priorities. What is essential? What is optional? What has been carried unnecessarily? Buddhism teaches renunciation, not as deprivation, but as release. Letting go of what drains energy is an act of wisdom. This release may involve disappointing others, changing routines, redefining roles. Buddhism acknowledges the discomfort this brings, but it also teaches that discomfort caused by alignment is different from discomfort caused by suppression. One leads to clarity, the other leads to collapse. Emotional exhaustion can become a turning point, not because it is dramatic, but because it forces honesty. You cannot pretend forever when the body refuses to cooperate. Buddhism sees this refusal as intelligence, not rebellion. When you stop fighting exhaustion, something shifts. You stop asking what is wrong with you and start asking what is true. This question opens space. In that space, alignment begins. As the body begins to soften and the mind stops fighting its own fatigue, a new question quietly forms, not about effort, not about duty, but about freedom. A question that challenges what you were taught about selflessness and asks whether choosing yourself might not be an escape from the path, but a return to it. There is a deep misunderstanding around choosing yourself. Many people hear it as indulgence, as selfishness, as turning away from others. Buddhism offers a different lens. It teaches that much of what looks like selflessness is actually attachment. Attachment to approval, attachment to identity, attachment to being needed. Choosing yourself, when understood clearly, is not about taking more. It is about clinging less. Non-attachment is often misunderstood as detachment or indifference. Buddhism does not teach emotional withdrawal. It teaches freedom from grasping at people, grasping at roles, grasping at outcomes. When you do not choose yourself, you often do so because you are attached to something external that feels necessary for safety or worth. Choosing yourself begins the moment you loosen that grip. Many people prioritize others not out of generosity but out of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood. This fear creates attachment. You stay because leaving feels threatening. You give because stopping feels dangerous. Buddhism names this clearly. When actions are driven by fear, they bind the mind. When actions are driven by clarity, they liberate it. Choosing yourself means noticing when an action is motivated by clinging rather than care. It means pausing long enough to feel the difference. Care feels open, clinging feels tight. Care does not demand a result. Clinging watches constantly. Buddhism teaches that freedom begins with this awareness. You cannot release what you do not see. Self-prioritization is often confused with ego. But ego is not caring for yourself. Ego is identification with an image. When you choose yourself to protect an identity, that is attachment. When you choose yourself to remain aligned with truth, that is non-attachment. The difference lies in intention, not behavior. There are moments when choosing yourself looks quiet, saying no without explanation, stepping back without drama, resting without apology. These choices are powerful because they weaken the habit of seeking permission to exist. Buddhism teaches that liberation does not require permission, it requires honesty. Non-attachment does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means releasing the belief that you are responsible for everything. When you choose yourself, you stop taking on emotional burdens that are not yours. You allow others to experience their own lives. This is not neglect, it is respect. Many people fear that choosing themselves will harm others. Buddhism addresses this fear by pointing to interdependence. When you are aligned, your actions are clearer, your presence is steadier. You respond rather than react. This reduces suffering in the system as a whole. Choosing yourself is not withdrawal from relationship. It is cleaning the relationship of resentment and obligation. There is often guilt when you begin to choose yourself. This guilt is not a sign of wrongdoing. It is a sign of conditioning. You were trained to equate self-denial with goodness. Buddhism sees guilt as a mental formation, not a moral truth. When conditioning is challenged, discomfort arises. This is not failure, it is transformation in progress. Choosing yourself also interrupts karmic patterns. When you stop repeating actions driven by fear or attachment, momentum shifts. New possibilities open. Buddhism teaches that karma changes the moment intention changes. You are not bound to repeat the past once awareness is present. Self-prioritization also brings you closer to impermanence. When you choose yourself, you accept that not everyone will stay, that roles will change, that some connections were maintained through sacrifice rather than mutuality. Buddhism teaches that clinging to what must change creates suffering. Letting change happen creates freedom. There is a subtle strength that emerges here. You no longer negotiate your needs internally. You stop convincing yourself to endure what feels wrong. This does not make life perfect, it makes it honest. Buddhism values honesty because it is the ground of insight. Choosing yourself is also an act of trust. Trust in your inner signals. Trust that you do not need to prove your worth through exhaustion. Trust that life continues even when you stop forcing it. This trust is central to non-attachment. When you trust, you loosen control. Control is often mistaken for care. When you choose others over yourself repeatedly, there is often an attempt to control outcomes, to keep peace, to prevent loss. Buddhism teaches that control is another form of clinging. It creates tension because reality does not obey it. Choosing yourself releases this tension by acknowledging what you can and cannot influence. As you choose yourself, you may notice a shift in how you relate to desire. You want less approval, less reassurance, less certainty. This is not numbness, it is simplicity. Buddhism teaches that desire narrows attention. When desire loosens, awareness expands. Self-prioritization also changes how you experience compassion. Compassion becomes less reactive. You no longer rush to fix. You listen more. You offer help when it is appropriate, not when it is demanded by fear. This form of compassion is sustainable because it does not cost you yourself. There may be moments of loneliness as you choose yourself. This loneliness is not abandonment, it is space opening where noise once lived. Buddhism does not rush to fill this space. It recognizes it as fertile. In this space, clarity grows. Choosing yourself also clarifies boundaries. Boundaries are not defenses. They are expressions of non-attachment. They mark where you end and others begin. Buddhism teaches that confusion about boundaries creates suffering. Clear boundaries reduce it. As attachment loosens, you may feel lighter, not because life is easier, but because you are no longer carrying what is not yours. This lightness is not excitement, it is ease. Buddhism values ease because it supports awareness. Self-prioritization is not a single decision, it is a practice. Each time you notice clinging and choose alignment instead, the habit weakens. Each time you listen inwardly, trust grows. Buddhism emphasizes practice because liberation is lived, not thought. There is also humility in choosing yourself. You accept that you cannot save everyone, that your role is limited, that your responsibility begins and ends with your actions, not others' reactions. This humility dissolves ego more effectively than self-denial ever could. Choosing yourself aligns action with truth. When action and truth align, suffering decreases. This is not because life becomes gentle, but because resistance softens. Buddhism teaches that resistance, not pain, is what exhausts the mind. As this alignment deepens, the need to justify yourself fades. You stop explaining why you need rest, why you need space, why you need change. Non-attachment does not require defense. It stands quietly. There is a calm that grows here, not dramatic, not constant, but reliable. A calm that comes from knowing you are not betraying yourself. Buddhism teaches that inner peace is not found by escaping the world, but by meeting it without clinging. As choosing yourself becomes quieter and more natural, a familiar tension often rises in its place. Not from doubt about your needs, but from concern about how others will receive them. A tightness that asks whether staying aligned will cost you connection. This is where another belief reveals itself, one so common it is rarely questioned, yet powerful enough to shape entire lives. The fear of disappointing others feels personal, but Buddhism sees it as impersonal. Not a flaw in character, but a misunderstanding of how self and reality actually work. People-pleasing is not kindness taken too far. It is perception distorted by fear and impermanence misunderstood. At the center of this fear is an assumption that others' reactions define your safety, your worth, your belonging. This assumption forms early, when approval feels essential for survival. Over time, it hardens into a belief that harmony must be maintained at all costs. Buddhism calls this a delusion, not as an insult, but as a description of seeing something inaccurately. The delusion is this, that you are responsible for how others feel, that your role is to manage disappointment before it arises. That conflict means failure. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when we take ownership of what does not belong to us. Other people's emotions arise from countless causes, many beyond your control. Treating them as your responsibility creates endless tension. People-pleasing often appears as attentiveness. You notice shifts in tone, you anticipate needs, you adjust behavior to keep things smooth. This may look caring, but internally it creates vigilance. The mind stays alert, scanning for signs of disapproval. This vigilance is exhausting because it is built on the belief that acceptance is fragile. Buddhism teaches impermanence as a core truth. Emotions change, opinions shift, relationships evolve. When you fear disappointing others, you are resisting impermanence. You are trying to freeze approval in place. This resistance creates suffering because reality does not cooperate. No amount of pleasing can guarantee lasting harmony. There is also a misunderstanding of self involved. People-pleasing assumes a solid self that must be protected through behavior. Buddhism teaches that the self is not fixed. It is a process, changing moment by moment. When you cling to an image of being liked or approved, you reinforce the illusion of a stable identity that must be maintained. This clinging creates anxiety. The fear of disappointment often leads to self-silencing. You hesitate to speak honestly. You soften your truth. You delay decisions. Buddhism sees this as a loss of right speech, not because you are lying, but because you are withholding what is true out of fear. Over time, this erodes integrity. You begin to feel divided between what you show and what you feel. People-pleasing also confuses compassion with control. When you try to prevent disappointment, you are attempting to manage others' inner experiences. Buddhism teaches that this is impossible. Each person meets reality through their own conditioning. Trying to control reactions only increases attachment and frustration. There is often a belief that disappointing others causes harm. Buddhism challenges this by distinguishing pain from suffering. Disappointment is a form of pain. It arises naturally when expectations meet reality. Suffering arises when pain is resisted, judged, or personalized. Allowing disappointment to exist does not create suffering. Avoiding it at all costs does. The fear of disappointing others also rests on a distorted sense of permanence. You may believe that one moment of disappointment will define the relationship. Buddhism teaches that relationships are fluid. They are not destroyed by single moments of honesty. They are weakened by long-term inauthenticity. People-pleasing often creates resentment that has no outlet. You give consent outwardly while resisting inwardly. This resistance builds quietly. Buddhism teaches that unacknowledged resentment poisons the mind. It turns compassion into obligation. It turns connection into burden. Another layer of this fear is the belief that your needs are disruptive, that expressing limits creates instability. Buddhism teaches that instability is already present because change is constant. Pretending otherwise does not create peace. It creates delay. There is also fear of abandonment beneath people-pleasing, the belief that if you disappoint, you will be left. Buddhism addresses this by pointing to non-self. No one can guarantee permanence in relationship. Clinging to approval does not prevent loss, it only prevents freedom. When you begin to release people-pleasing, guilt often appears. This guilt is conditioned. It arises when old survival strategies are challenged. Buddhism does not interpret guilt as truth. It sees it as a mental habit that loses power when observed. Letting others be disappointed is an act of respect. It allows them to experience their emotions without interference. Buddhism teaches that each person's path includes encountering discomfort. Protecting others from all disappointment denies them growth. People-pleasing also keeps you stuck in the future. You are always anticipating reactions, rehearsing responses, managing outcomes. Buddhism emphasizes present moment awareness. Fear of disappointment pulls attention away from now into imagined scenarios that rarely unfold as expected. As awareness grows, you may notice how often fear of disappointment guided your choices. Seeing this clearly is not condemnation, it is insight. Buddhism teaches that insight weakens delusion naturally. What is seen clearly loses its grip. There is a quiet relief when you stop managing others' expectations. Energy returns, decisions simplify, you speak more directly. This does not mean you become careless, it means you become accurate. Accuracy reduces suffering. Disappointing others does not mean acting without care. It means acting without attachment to outcome. Buddhism teaches that right action is guided by intention, not approval. When intention is clear, reactions can be met without collapse. As you allow disappointment to exist, you may notice that many relationships remain intact. Some even improve, others shift. Buddhism teaches that impermanence reveals truth. What depends on self-erasure cannot remain healthy. People-pleasing also distorts compassion toward yourself. You judge your needs harshly. You minimize discomfort. Buddhism teaches self-compassion as part of wisdom. Ignoring your own suffering does not reduce the world's suffering, it adds to it. There is courage required here, the courage to be misunderstood, to allow silence, to let others feel what they feel. Buddhism values this courage because it aligns with reality rather than illusion. As fear loosens, trust grows. Trust that you can survive disapproval. Trust that relationships are resilient or honest enough to change. Trust that your worth does not fluctuate with reactions. Buddhism teaches that this trust supports liberation. People-pleasing fades not through force, but through understanding. When you see that fear is built on misperception, it softens. When you see impermanence clearly, clinging relaxes. As the fear of disappointing others loosens its grip, another assumption quietly comes into view, an assumption that has been praised, rewarded, even spiritualized. The idea that putting yourself last is the fastest way forward, that dissolving into service will somehow lead you out of suffering. This is where a deeper question begins to stir, one that asks whether constant self-sacrifice actually brings awakening closer, or whether it quietly keeps it out of reach. Self-sacrifice has long been associated with virtue. Many spiritual paths have honored renunciation, service, humility. Over time, these values have been misunderstood. What began as a practice of releasing ego has, for many, become a habit of disappearing. Buddhism makes a careful distinction here. Letting go of ego is not the same as abandoning awareness of self. When self-sacrifice turns into self-neglect, awakening does not accelerate, it stalls. Awakening in Buddhism is rooted in direct seeing sensations as they arise, seeing thoughts without identification, seeing emotions without suppression. This requires presence. When attention is constantly directed outward toward others' needs, moods, and expectations, presence weakens. The mind becomes busy managing instead of observing. This outward focus may look compassionate, but it leaves little space for insight to deepen. Constantly putting others first often begins with good intention. You want to reduce suffering, you want to help. But intention alone does not determine outcome. Buddhism teaches that wisdom must guide compassion. Without wisdom, compassion becomes entanglement. You may serve endlessly while remaining unaware of your own patterns, reactions, and attachments. Awakening requires turning attention inward as much as outward. Self-sacrifice can become a way to avoid inner work. When life is filled with responsibilities, caretaking, and service, there is little time left to sit with discomfort. Silence becomes rare. Stillness feels indulgent. Buddhism points out that avoiding stillness delays insight. Without space to observe the mind, habitual patterns continue unseen. There is also identity hidden in self-sacrifice. Being the one who gives can become who you are. This identity feels meaningful, it offers purpose, but it also creates attachment. You may feel lost without someone to help. Buddhism teaches that attachment to identity, even a noble one, obscures clarity. Awakening asks for the courage to exist without roles, When self-sacrifice is constant, resentment often grows quietly. You may not express it, you may not even admit it to yourself, but it appears as fatigue, irritation, or emotional distance. Buddhism teaches that unacknowledged resentment clouds the mind. It distorts perception. A mind carrying resentment cannot see clearly. Another cost is the postponement of personal truth. You may delay important realizations because there is always someone else who needs attention. Your own questions wait. Your own doubts are set aside. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not a future reward. It happens in the present moment. When the present is always given away, awakening is deferred. Self-sacrifice can also reinforce the illusion of separation. When you see yourself primarily as the helper and others as those who need help, a subtle hierarchy forms. Buddhism teaches non-duality, the understanding that there is no fundamental separation between self and other. True compassion arises from this understanding. Self-sacrifice that reinforces roles keeps separation intact. There is a misunderstanding that suffering endured willingly leads to awakening. Buddhism challenges this directly. Suffering does not purify by itself. Awareness does. You can suffer endlessly without awakening if suffering is met with resistance, suppression, or identity. Self-sacrifice that lacks awareness only deepens conditioning. Awakening requires energy, not frantic energy, but stable presence. Constant self-sacrifice drains this energy. When the system is depleted, attention scatters. Meditation becomes difficult. Reflection feels heavy. Buddhism recognizes this. Monastic traditions include rest, silence, and balance for a reason. Without balance, insight cannot stabilize. There is also fear beneath self-sacrifice. Fear that turning inward is selfish. Fear that prioritizing awareness means abandoning others. Buddhism reframes this. It teaches that a mind that is clear benefits everyone it touches. A mind that is exhausted spreads confusion, even with good intentions. Self-sacrifice can delay awakening by reinforcing avoidance. When helping others becomes the main activity, it can prevent confrontation with personal suffering. Buddhism teaches that liberation requires meeting suffering directly, not fixing it immediately, not bypassing it through service, but understanding it. There is also a subtle control element. When you sacrifice yourself, you may unconsciously try to shape outcomes, to keep things stable, to prevent collapse. Buddhism teaches that control is another form of attachment. Awakening involves releasing the need to manage reality. Many people fear that without self-sacrifice, compassion disappears. Buddhism teaches the opposite. When self-sacrifice loosens, compassion becomes clearer. It is no longer mixed with obligation or fear. It arises naturally from understanding. Spiritual development requires honesty. You must see when giving is generous and when it is compulsive, when service is free and when it is driven by avoidance. Buddhism encourages this honesty because it dismantles illusion gently. Self-sacrifice often delays awakening by keeping the focus on doing rather than being. Buddhism emphasizes being aware, being present, being with what arises. Doing flows naturally from this being. When doing replaces being, awakening remains conceptual. There is also grief that arises when self-sacrifice is questioned. Grief for the meaning it provided, grief for the validation it offered. Buddhism allows this grief. It understands that letting go of familiar patterns feels like loss, but beneath the grief is space. Awakening is not about becoming less human, it is about becoming more aware. This awareness includes recognizing limits, recognizing needs, recognizing when service is aligned and when it is not. Self-sacrifice that ignores limits weakens awareness. When you begin to reclaim attention from constant giving, you may feel discomfort. Others may notice the change. Buddhism teaches that this discomfort is not a sign of error. It is a sign of transition. Old patterns resist dissolution. Self-sacrifice can also delay awakening by keeping you tied to stories about who you are supposed to be. Awakening dissolves stories. It reveals experience before narrative. This requires stepping out of roles, even respected ones. There is a quiet permission that arises when this is seen clearly. Permission to rest, permission to reflect, permission to let others carry their own lives. Buddhism teaches that letting others be is an act of respect, not neglect. As attention returns inward, insight deepens. You begin to see thoughts as thoughts, emotions as emotions. You respond instead of react. This is awakening in motion. It does not require withdrawal from the world. It requires clarity within it. Self-sacrifice does not disappear entirely. It becomes conscious, chosen, balanced. Buddhism values this balance. The middle path avoids extremes, neither self-erasure nor self-absorption. When self-sacrifice no longer delays awareness, service becomes expression rather than escape. You help because it is appropriate, not because it defines you. Awakening unfolds naturally in this space. As attention turns inward again and the noise of constant doing begins to quiet, something tender often rises to the surface. Not panic, not drama, but a soft ache that has been waiting patiently. It is the feeling that time has passed while parts of you stayed still. This is where another truth asks to be seen, one that speaks not of failure, but of something far more human. There is a kind of grief that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with tears or obvious loss. It lives quietly in the background, showing up as restlessness, nostalgia, or a vague sense that something important was missed. Buddhism recognizes this grief clearly. It is the grief of an unlived life, the sorrow that arises when inner wisdom is repeatedly ignored. Regret is often misunderstood. It is treated as weakness, as dwelling on the past, as something to push away. Buddhism sees it differently. Regret is not about mistakes. It is about misalignment. It arises when the inner voice that knew what mattered was silenced for too long. It is not punishment. It is memory. Inner wisdom is subtle. It does not shout. It whispers through discomfort, curiosity, longing, and resistance. When you ignore it once or twice, it fades slightly. When you ignore it for years, it turns into grief. This grief is not loud because it was never allowed to be expressed. It learned to stay quiet. Many people live outwardly full lives while inwardly feeling unfinished. They met expectations. They fulfilled roles. They did what was required. Yet something essential remained untouched. Buddhism teaches that this feeling is not ingratitude. It is truth trying to surface. The silent grief of an unlived life often appears later when momentum slows, when distractions fall away, when achievements no longer distract from the question of meaning. It is then that regret emerges, not as a list of wrong choices, but as a feeling of distance from oneself. Buddhism explains that suffering increases when wisdom is ignored. Wisdom here does not mean intelligence. It means knowing what aligns with your nature. When you repeatedly choose safety over truth, approval over authenticity, familiarity over growth, wisdom is sidelined. Regret is the signal that this sidelining has gone on too long. This grief is often complicated by shame. You may tell yourself you have no right to feel it, that others had fewer options, that you should be grateful. Buddhism does not deny gratitude. It simply says gratitude and grief can coexist. Feeling regret does not cancel appreciation, it completes honesty. The unlived life is not about dramatic dreams abandoned. It is often about small truths ignored. Conversations never had, boundaries never set, paths never explored. Each small avoidance accumulates. Over time, the accumulation becomes heavy. Regret also arises from self-betrayal. Each time you knew something was wrong, but stayed silent. Each time you felt called towards something, but dismissed it as impractical. Buddhism teaches that the body and mind remember these moments. Even when the mind forgets, the body holds the record. This grief is silent because it was learned early that expressing it would disrupt stability. You learn to keep going, to be strong, to adapt. Buddhism honors adaptation, but it also teaches that adaptation without awareness leads to suffering. The unlived life is not a moral failure. It is a consequence of conditioning. You were shaped by circumstances, expectations, fears. Buddhism does not blame, it invites understanding. Understanding loosens regret's grip. Regret is also tied to impermanence. Time moves forward whether awareness is present or not. When inner wisdom is ignored, time feels wasted. Buddhism teaches that impermanence is not cruel. It is precise. It reveals where attention was missing. There is often fear that acknowledging regret means being stuck in the past. Buddhism counters this. Ignoring regret keeps you stuck. Feeling it allows movement. Regret points toward what still matters. It carries information, not condemnation. The silent grief of an unlived life also reflects unmet potential, not potential measured by success, but by authenticity, the potential to be present, to be honest, to be aligned. Buddhism teaches that potential is not something to achieve, it is something to uncover. Many people respond to regret by rushing forward, making sudden changes, forcing reinvention. Buddhism advises patience. Regret needs to be felt before it can release, not analyzed endlessly, but allowed space. There is tenderness required here. You may mourn versions of yourself that never had a chance to emerge. Buddhism allows mourning. It sees mourning as part of wisdom returning. This grief also reveals how deeply you cared. You do not regret what never mattered. Regret is evidence of value. Buddhism reframes regret as a sign of sensitivity, not failure. Ignoring inner wisdom often felt necessary at the time. You may have been protecting others, protecting stability, protecting yourself from uncertainty. Buddhism does not judge past choices made without awareness. It focuses on present awareness. The unlived life can create a sense of urgency, a feeling that time is running out. Buddhism teaches that urgency without clarity leads to panic. Urgency with awareness leads to intention. Regret clarifies intention when it is met honestly. There is also forgiveness needed, not forgiveness from others, but from yourself. Buddhism teaches that holding on to self-blame deepens suffering, understanding dissolves it. Regret softens when you see that inner wisdom never disappeared. It waited, it waits still. Buddhism teaches that awakening is always possible because awareness is always present. The silent grief becomes less heavy when it is named, not publicly, internally. Naming is acknowledging. Buddhism values acknowledgement because it restores truth. As regret is allowed, it transforms. It becomes discernment. You begin to see more clearly what you no longer want to ignore. This clarity is not about fixing the past. It is about meeting the present. The unlived life does not mean life is over. It means something is asking to begin. Buddhism teaches that every moment of awareness is a beginning. Regret also teaches humility. You see how often fear guided decisions. This humility is not self-attack, it is realism. Buddhism values realism because it cuts through illusion. When regret is resisted, it turns into bitterness. When it is welcomed, it becomes guidance. Buddhism makes this distinction clearly. What is resisted persists. What is understood changes. The grief of an unlived life can feel lonely because it is deeply personal. Others may not see it. Buddhism teaches that loneliness eases when experience is met without judgment. This grief does not demand immediate action. It asks for presence, for listening, for honesty. Rushing to erase it misses its teaching. As you sit with this understanding, something shifts. Regret stops feeling like a verdict and starts feeling like a message that says awareness is returning. As regret softens and clarity begins to return, another tension often reveals itself. A tension not about what you want, but about whether you are allowed to want it without defending yourself. This is where healing moves from understanding into action, and where one of the hardest practices quietly appears. There is a deep discomfort many people feel when they say no, not because the no is unclear, but because silence follows it. A silence that feels unfinished, a silence that seems to demand explanation. Buddhism pays close attention to this moment, because it reveals one of the strongest attachments we carry: the need to justify our boundaries in order to be allowed to have them. Most people were taught that no is acceptable only when it is reasonable, polite, well explained, and approved. You learn to soften refusal with stories, to offer context, to apologize for having limits. Over time, explanation became a requirement for self-protection. Buddhism sees this habit not as courtesy, but as attachment. The need to explain comes from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being judged, fear of being seen as selfish or unkind. Buddhism teaches that fear arises when identity is threatened. When your sense of self depends on how others perceive you, explanation becomes a defense mechanism. Saying no without explanation feels exposed. It removes the buffer between you and others' reactions. This exposure is uncomfortable because it challenges a long-held belief that you are responsible for managing how others feel about your choices. Buddhism names this belief as a source of suffering. Healing requires saying no without explanation, because explanation often turns into negotiation. When you explain, you invite debate. You offer reasons that can be questioned, minimized, or dismissed. This keeps you entangled. Buddhism teaches that clarity is not improved through justification, it is weakened by it. When you say no simply and clearly, you are practicing non-attachment. You are releasing the need to control the outcome. You are allowing others to respond however they will. This is not indifference, it is trust in impermanence. The urge to explain often comes from guilt. Guilt that arises not from wrongdoing, but from breaking a familiar pattern. Buddhism distinguishes between wise remorse and conditioned guilt. Wise remorse corrects harm. Conditioned guilt enforces conformity. Most guilt around saying no belongs to the second category. Explanation can also be a way to avoid discomfort. Silence feels awkward. Letting others be unhappy feels wrong. Buddhism teaches that discomfort is not a problem to solve. It is an experience to allow. Avoiding discomfort delays healing because it reinforces fear. There is also a power shift when you stop explaining. You return authority to yourself. You stop asking for permission to honor your limits. Buddhism sees this as reclaiming agency. Agency is essential for liberation because it restores alignment between intention and action. Saying no without explanation does not mean being harsh. Tone can be gentle, presence can be kind. What is released is not compassion, but self-erasure. Buddhism teaches that compassion does not require self-betrayal. Many people worry that without explanation, they will be misunderstood. Buddhism responds simply, misunderstanding is part of impermanence. You cannot control how others interpret your actions. Trying to do so creates endless suffering. Explanation often comes from the hope that if others understand your reasons, they will not be disappointed. Buddhism teaches that disappointment is a natural part of human interaction. Preventing it at all costs is not kindness, it is avoidance. There is also a subtle identity at play. Being reasonable, being accommodating, being the one who explains. Letting go of explanation threatens this identity. Buddhism teaches that identity clinging creates suffering. Releasing it creates space. When you stop explaining, you may notice how often you explained things that needed no defense, how often you overfunction to maintain harmony. Seeing this clearly can be unsettling. Buddhism encourages staying with this discomfort rather than fixing it quickly. Saying no without explanation strengthens self-trust. You begin to rely less on external validation and more on inner clarity. This trust is not stubbornness, it is alignment. There is also a nervous system shift that occurs. When you stop justifying, the body learns that boundaries are safe. Over time, anxiety decreases. Decisions feel simpler. Buddhism understands this somatic change as part of awakening, not separate from it. Explanation often keeps you in the past or future. You reference history, you anticipate reactions. Buddhism emphasizes presence. A clear, no spoken now requires no timeline. Healing also requires releasing the belief that your boundaries must make sense to others. Buddhism teaches that truth does not require consensus. Inner alignment is not a group decision. There may be moments when explanation is appropriate. Buddhism does not forbid communication. It simply asks that explanation not come from fear. The practice is discernment, knowing when words are offered freely and when they are offered defensively. When you say no without explanation, you may notice who respects it and who does not. This clarity is valuable. Buddhism teaches that clarity reveals truth without force. There is often grief here. Grief for relationships that relied on your over-explaining. Grief for roles that required justification. Buddhism allows this grief. It understands that healing involves loss of what was familiar. Saying no without explanation is also a practice of humility. You accept that you may be seen inaccurately. Buddhism teaches that being misunderstood is not failure. It is part of releasing ego. This practice reduces internal conflict. You stop rehearsing conversations. You stop managing impressions. Mental energy returns. Buddhism values this simplicity because it supports awareness. Over time, saying no becomes less charged. It loses drama. It becomes information rather than defense. Buddhism teaches that repetition rewires habit. Each clear boundary weakens attachment. Healing does not require you to convince anyone. It requires you to be honest. Saying no without explanation is honesty in action. As the habit of explaining loosens, another belief quietly loses its grip. A belief so familiar it once felt like care itself. The belief that harmony depends on you, that emotional balance is something you must manage, that if someone is upset, it must somehow be your fault. This is where a deeper illusion begins to show itself, one that has shaped countless choices without ever being questioned. Many people move through life carrying an invisible responsibility, not for actions, but for emotions. You feel it when someone is disappointed, and you rush to fix it. When someone is angry and you feel guilty before understanding why. When someone is sad and you assume it is your job to make it better. Buddhism looks closely at this pattern and names it clearly. It is not compassion, it is confusion. The illusion of responsibility for others' emotions begins with a misunderstanding of causality. Emotions do not arise from a single source. They are the result of conditioning, memory, expectation, biology, and countless unseen factors. Buddhism teaches dependent origination, the understanding that nothing arises independently. When you believe you caused someone's emotional state simply by being yourself, you ignore this complexity and place impossible weight on your shoulders. This illusion often forms early. In environments where emotional safety was uncertain, you learned to read moods carefully. You learned that adjusting yourself could prevent conflict. Over time, this became a survival strategy. You stayed alert. You stayed accommodating. You learned to regulate others in order to feel safe. Buddhism does not judge this adaptation. It simply points out that what once protected you may now be imprisoning you. Taking ownership of others' emotions creates suffering because it erases boundaries between inner worlds. You begin to feel what others feel as if it belongs to you. Their disappointment becomes your shame. Their anger becomes your anxiety. Their sadness becomes your burden. Buddhism teaches that compassion requires closeness without fusion. When fusion occurs, clarity is lost. This illusion also creates powerlessness. If you believe you are responsible for how others feel, you will constantly try to control situations. You will choose words carefully. You will anticipate reactions. You will avoid honesty to prevent discomfort. Buddhism teaches that control is a response to fear, not a path to peace. Reality does not obey control, it resists it. There is also a subtle arrogance hidden in this illusion, not arrogance in intention, but in assumption. When you believe you cause others' emotions, you place yourself at the center of their inner lives. Buddhism gently dissolves this view. Each person experiences the world through their own conditioning. You influence, but you do not control. Confusing influence with responsibility creates suffering on both sides. When you take responsibility for others' emotions, you deny them their own agency. You step into their inner world and try to manage it. This may feel helpful, but it can prevent growth. Buddhism teaches that each person must encounter their own emotions to develop wisdom. Shielding them from discomfort delays this process. This illusion also distorts compassion. Compassion becomes urgent, reactive, anxious. You rush to soothe not because it is appropriate, but because you cannot tolerate the discomfort of someone else's distress. Buddhism teaches that true compassion can sit with discomfort without needing to erase it. Carrying responsibility for others' emotions also leads to chronic anxiety. You are always scanning for emotional shifts. You worry about tone, timing, response. This vigilance keeps the nervous system activated. Buddhism recognizes this state as suffering, not because something is wrong, but because awareness has been replaced by fear. The illusion is reinforced by social messages. Be nice, keep the peace, don't upset anyone. Buddhism does not dismiss harmony, but it questions the cost. Harmony built on self-erasure is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. It collapses under truth. Taking ownership of others' emotions also blurs ethical clarity. You may tolerate harm to prevent distress. You may avoid setting boundaries to avoid disappointment. Buddhism teaches that avoiding short-term discomfort often creates long-term suffering. Allowing emotions to arise is not harm, avoiding truth is. There is also exhaustion that comes from this illusion. Emotional labor becomes constant. You feel responsible even when you are not involved. You carry guilt that has no clear origin. Buddhism teaches that this exhaustion is a signal that boundaries are needed, not that you must try harder. The belief that you are responsible for others' emotions also keeps you stuck in the past and future. You replay conversations. You anticipate reactions. Buddhism emphasizes present moment awareness. Emotional responsibility pulls attention away from now into imagined outcomes. This illusion often masquerades as empathy. You tell yourself you are just sensitive, just caring. Buddhism distinguishes empathy from enmeshment. Empathy understands without absorbing. Enmeshment absorbs without understanding. The latter drains awareness. Letting go of this illusion can feel frightening. You may worry that without emotional responsibility, you will become cold. Buddhism teaches the opposite. When you stop carrying what is not yours, you become more present, more grounded, more capable of genuine care. Releasing responsibility for others' emotions does not mean ignoring impact. You still act ethically. You still consider consequences. Buddhism teaches right action, but right action does not include managing inner states that are beyond your control. There is a difference between accountability and responsibility. Accountability relates to your actions. Responsibility for emotions assumes control over experience. Buddhism encourages accountability and releases false responsibility. When you allow others to feel what they feel, you respect impermanence. Emotions arise and pass. Interfering with this process creates stagnation. Buddhism trusts the natural movement of experience. You may notice resistance when you stop taking responsibility. Others may be uncomfortable. This does not mean you are causing harm. It means a familiar dynamic is changing. Buddhism teaches that discomfort often accompanies truth. Letting go of emotional responsibility also restores honesty. You speak more directly. You stop cushioning truth excessively. This clarity supports healthier relationships. Buddhism values clarity because it reduces confusion. There is also relief that comes when you realize you were never meant to carry everyone's feelings. Relief in the body, relief in the mind. Buddhism sees this relief as the easing of ignorance. This release allows others to step into their own strength. When you stop managing emotions, others learn to manage themselves. This is not abandonment, it is respect. The illusion of responsibility also keeps you from fully knowing yourself. When attention is always outward, inner awareness fades. Buddhism teaches that liberation requires turning inward without neglecting the world. As this illusion dissolves, compassion becomes steadier. You can care without panic, support without control, listen without absorbing. This is compassion rooted in wisdom. You may grieve the years spent carrying what was never yours. Buddhism allows this grief. It sees grief as clarity arriving late, not as failure. Releasing emotional responsibility does not happen instantly. It is practiced. Each time you notice the urge to fix and choose presence instead, the habit weakens. Buddhism teaches practice because insight deepens through repetition. As the weight of carrying others' emotions is finally set down, a quiet space opens. Not empty, not lonely, but unfamiliar. In that space, a new question arises, not about connection, but about distance, about stepping back without disappearing, about choosing solitude without turning away from life itself. Solitude is often misunderstood. Many people hear it as rejection, withdrawal, avoidance. Buddhism makes a careful distinction. There is a form of solitude that comes from fear, and there is a form that comes from clarity. One shrinks the world, the other allows you to meet it more honestly. Avoidance-driven solitude is reactive. It happens when the world feels overwhelming, when emotions feel too loud, when relationships feel too demanding. In this state, solitude is used as a shield. You withdraw not to listen, but to escape. Buddhism does not condemn this response. It understands that sometimes retreat is the only way the system can regulate. But it also teaches that escape does not lead to freedom. It only postpones engagement. Sacred solitude is different. It is chosen, not forced. It is entered with awareness, not fear. It is not about hiding from the world, but about returning to yourself so you can meet the world without distortion. Buddhism values this kind of solitude because insight requires space. In everyday life, attention is constantly pulled outward. Conversations, responsibilities, expectations, stimulation. Over time, this outward pull fragments awareness. You respond automatically. You react habitually. Solitude interrupts this momentum. It slows the stream of input so the mind can see itself clearly. Buddhist practice has long included periods of withdrawal, not as rejection of society, but as a way to observe the mind without constant interference. When stimulation decreases, patterns become visible, thoughts repeat, emotions surface, restlessness appears. This is not failure, it is revelation. Avoidance seeks comfort. Sacred solitude seeks truth. Comfort tries to quiet discomfort quickly. Truth allows discomfort to speak. Buddhism teaches that discomfort is not the enemy. Unawareness is. Solitude creates conditions where awareness can deepen. There is often fear around choosing solitude. Fear of being forgotten, fear of missing out, fear of becoming disconnected. Buddhism addresses this fear by pointing to interdependence. Connection does not disappear when you step back. It becomes clearer. When you are no longer entangled, you relate more honestly. Sacred solitude is not isolation. Isolation cuts you off from life. Solitude brings you into deeper contact with it. The difference lies in intention. Are you withdrawing to numb or to know? Are you stepping back to avoid or to align? In avoidance, solitude feels heavy. Time drags, thoughts spiral. There is agitation beneath the quiet. In sacred solitude, there may still be discomfort, but there is also curiosity. You observe what arises instead of trying to suppress it. Buddhism encourages this observation because insight grows from seeing patterns, not escaping them. Choosing solitude also challenges identity. Without constant interaction, roles fall away. You are no longer the helper, the fixer, the responder. This can feel unsettling. Buddhism teaches that identity is maintained through repetition. Solitude disrupts repetition, allowing you to see who you are without performance. Many people fear that solitude means disengagement from responsibility. Buddhism clarifies that withdrawal can be temporary and purposeful. Monastics retreat and return. Lay practitioners step back and re-engage. Solitude is a rhythm, not a permanent state. Avoidance-driven withdrawal often lacks clarity about return. You pull away without knowing when or how you will come back. Sacred solitude includes intention to re-enter. You step back to see clearly so that engagement can be wiser. Solitude also reveals attachment. Without distraction, desires surface. Cravings become obvious. Aversion shows itself. Buddhism teaches that seeing attachment clearly weakens it. Solitude is a mirror. It does not create problems, it reveals them. There is also grief that may appear in solitude. Grief that was postponed by busyness, sadness that had no space. Buddhism welcomes this grief. It understands that feeling what was delayed is part of healing. Sacred solitude requires boundaries. It is chosen, not drifted into. You set conditions. You protect the space. Buddhism values discipline not as control, but as support for awareness. Without structure, solitude can slide into rumination. Avoidance often comes with blame. You withdraw because others are too much. Sacred solitude comes with responsibility. You withdraw to understand your own reactions. This responsibility keeps solitude from becoming resentment. Solitude also strengthens discernment. Without constant input, you notice what truly matters, what drains energy, what nourishes. Buddhism teaches discernment as a key aspect of wisdom. Solitude sharpens it. Choosing solitude can feel selfish in a culture that equates availability with worth. Buddhism challenges this assumption. It teaches that a mind that is never alone cannot know itself. Without knowing yourself, your engagement with others remains reactive. Sacred solitude is not about cutting ties. It is about loosening them enough to see clearly. When attachment softens, connection becomes freer. You return not out of obligation, but out of choice. There is also humility in solitude. You see how busy the mind is, how restless, how repetitive. Buddhism does not judge this. It sees it as the starting point of insight. Avoidance avoids discomfort. Sacred solitude sits with it. This sitting builds capacity. You learn that discomfort rises and falls. You do not need to flee. This learning carries back into the world. Solitude also reveals inner resources. Without external validation, you discover what steadies you: breath, awareness, simple presence. Buddhism teaches that these resources are always available, but rarely noticed in noise. Choosing solitude without escaping the world means you do not use it to avoid necessary conversations or responsibilities. You return when clarity is gained. Buddhism emphasizes this return. Wisdom is tested in relationship, not in isolation. There may be resistance from others when you choose solitude. Misunderstanding, assumptions. Buddhism teaches that being misunderstood is part of practice. You cannot live aligned and avoid all friction. Sacred solitude also reduces dependency. You stop relying on constant feedback. You trust your own experience. This trust strengthens autonomy without hardening the heart. Avoidance-driven solitude often ends in stagnation. Sacred solitude leads to movement. Not frantic movement, but intentional action. You see more clearly what needs to change. Solitude teaches patience. Without stimulation, time slows. You learn to stay with moments. Buddhism values patience because insight unfolds at its own pace. Choosing solitude is not a rejection of love. It is a refinement of it. Love that includes space breathes. Love without space suffocates. As solitude deepens, you may notice a quieter sense of presence. Not excitement, not escape, just steadiness. Buddhism points to this steadiness as a sign of alignment. Sacred solitude also prepares you for uncertainty. When you can be with yourself without distraction, uncertainty loses its threat. Buddhism teaches that uncertainty is inherent. Solitude helps you make peace with it. This choice does not remove you from the world. It changes how you meet it. You return less reactive, less entangled, more attentive. As solitude clarifies what belongs to you and what never did, another pattern begins to reveal itself. One that hides in plain sight. One that wears the mask of virtue. The pattern that looks like humility, but quietly feeds identity. This is where a deeper illusion comes into focus, one that challenges the belief that denying the self always dissolves the ego. Selflessness is often praised as the highest good. To give without asking, to put others first, to erase personal desire. Buddhism honors generosity and compassion, but it also warns that not all self-denial leads to freedom. Sometimes the ego does not disappear, it simply changes costumes. Ego in Buddhism is not arrogance or selfishness, it is identification. It is the habit of constructing a self-image and protecting it. This image can be grand or subtle. It can say, "I am special," or "I am nothing." Both are forms of clinging. Excessive self-denial often hides a refined ego, one that takes pride in disappearing. When you deny yourself constantly, it can feel pure. You are not demanding, you are not taking, you are not asserting. But look closer. There may be an identity forming around being the one who needs nothing, the one who endures, the one who sacrifices quietly. This identity feels safe because it is admired. It feels meaningful because it appears spiritual. Buddhism teaches that ego does not depend on self-importance. It depends on fixation. When you fixate on being selfless, you are still defining yourself. You are still measuring. You are still comparing. The mind says, "I am better because I want less." This is not freedom, it is ego refined. Excessive self-denial often comes from fear, not wisdom. Fear of desire, fear of attachment, fear of being ordinary, fear of being seen. Instead of meeting these fears directly, the mind chooses absence. It avoids wanting altogether. Buddhism teaches that avoiding desire is not the same as understanding it. Suppression does not liberate, awareness does. There is also control hidden in self-denial. When you refuse your own needs, you may feel morally superior. You are not asking, you are not dependent, you are not vulnerable. This control creates distance. Buddhism teaches that ego thrives on control, even when that control looks like humility. Self-denial can also be a way to avoid disappointment. If you expect nothing, you cannot be let down. If you need nothing, you cannot be refused. This strategy protects against pain, but it also limits intimacy. Buddhism teaches that intimacy requires openness, not disappearance. Another subtle ego appears when self-denial is used to earn worth. You may believe that the less you want, the more worthy you are. That spiritual maturity means having no preferences. Buddhism challenges this directly. Preferences are part of human experience. Awakening does not erase humanity, it clarifies it. Excessive self-denial often disconnects you from the body. Hunger, fatigue, longing are dismissed as obstacles. Buddhism teaches that the body is not an enemy, it is a field of awareness. Ignoring bodily truth creates imbalance. Balance is central to the middle path. The middle path is often misunderstood. It is not moderation for comfort. It is freedom from extremes. Self-indulgence binds through craving. Self-denial binds through aversion. Both are attachments. The ego can live comfortably in either extreme. There is also identity reinforcement through comparison. You may not compare yourself to those who have more. You compare yourself to those who need more. You become the one who is less demanding, less emotional, less attached. This comparison feeds subtle pride. Buddhism sees pride as a barrier to awakening, no matter how refined. Self-denial can also be used to avoid responsibility. If you claim to want nothing, you may avoid making choices. You let life happen to you. You call it surrender. Buddhism teaches that surrender without awareness is passivity. Awakening requires engagement with clarity, not withdrawal from agency. Another hidden ego appears in martyrdom. You suffer silently and expect recognition, even if unconsciously. When recognition does not come, resentment grows. Buddhism teaches that resentment is a sign of attachment. True selflessness leaves no residue. Excessive self-denial also limits compassion. When you deny your own needs, you may judge others for having them. You may see desire as weakness. Buddhism teaches compassion includes understanding the full range of human experience. Denying desire creates separation. There is also fear of power beneath self-denial, power to choose, power to speak, power to take up space. Buddhism teaches that power itself is not the problem. Attachment to power is. Avoiding power entirely is another way to avoid responsibility. Self-denial can feel safe because it reduces conflict. You do not assert, you do not disrupt. But Buddhism teaches that avoiding conflict at all costs leads to stagnation. Growth requires friction. There is a misunderstanding that enlightenment means having no self. Buddhism teaches non-self, not no self. Non-self means seeing that the self is not fixed. It does not mean erasing experience. When self-denial tries to eliminate experience, it misunderstands the teaching. Excessive self-denial often leads to emotional numbness. You stop wanting, but you also stop feeling. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not numbness. It is sensitivity without attachment. Numbness is avoidance, not freedom. There is also grief hidden in self-denial. Grief for desires never explored. Grief for expressions never allowed. Buddhism allows this grief to surface because it points to suppressed life. Self-denial can delay healing by preventing honest inquiry. If you believe wanting is wrong, you will not examine what you want. Buddhism teaches that inquiry dissolves craving. Suppression strengthens it. True humility in Buddhism is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking less about yourself. Excessive self-denial still centers the self, even if negatively. Awareness moves attention away from identity altogether. Letting go of ego does not require denying the self. It requires seeing through fixation. When you see how self-denial reinforces identity, the pattern loosens naturally. This realization can feel destabilizing. If you are not the one who sacrifices, who are you? Buddhism welcomes this question. It opens space beyond roles. When self-denial softens, authenticity emerges. You respond to life rather than perform spirituality. Buddhism values this authenticity because it aligns with reality. There is freedom in allowing desire without obeying it blindly. There is freedom in honoring needs without clinging to them. This balance dissolves ego more effectively than denial ever could. Excessive self-denial also prevents joy. Joy is not attachment. It is a natural response to presence. Buddhism includes joy as a factor of awakening. Denying joy out of fear is another misunderstanding. As this insight deepens, selflessness becomes simpler. You give when it is appropriate. You receive when it is appropriate. You do not define yourself by either. Ego loosens because there is nothing to defend. As the grip of self-denial loosens and the effort to be virtuous relaxes, something unfamiliar appears, a sense of not knowing who you are without the masks you have worn for so long. This uncertainty is not emptiness. It is an opening, a quiet space where a deeper question begins to breathe. Much of what we call identity is made of roles: parent, partner, healer, fixer, provider, the reliable one, the strong one. These roles give structure to life. They help us function in relationships and society. Buddhism does not deny their usefulness, but it asks a careful question. What happens when you believe these roles are who you are? Roles are forms. They arise in response to conditions. A child appears, and the role of parent forms. A relationship begins, and the role of partner takes shape. Someone is in pain, and the role of healer activates. These roles are not false, but when you cling to them as identity, suffering follows. Clinging happens quietly. You begin to measure yourself by how well you perform a role. Your worth becomes tied to how useful you are, how needed, how consistent. When the role is affirmed, you feel solid. When it is questioned or removed, you feel lost. Buddhism teaches that anything that creates fear when it changes is not the self. It is attachment. Roles are impermanent. Children grow. Relationships evolve. People heal or leave. Circumstances shift. When identity is built on roles, each change feels like a threat. You may resist change, not because it is wrong, but because it destabilizes who you think you are. This resistance creates suffering. Letting go of roles does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means releasing identification. You still care for children. You still show up in relationship. You still offer support, but you no longer confuse the function with your essence. Buddhism teaches that essence is not something you perform. The fixer role is especially seductive. It offers purpose and control. When problems arise, you step in. You organize, you soothe, you solve. This can be helpful. But when fixing becomes identity, you may feel anxious when there is nothing to fix. You may unconsciously seek dysfunction to remain relevant. Buddhism points out that this is not compassion. It is attachment to usefulness. The healer role carries similar weight. You become the one who holds space, who listens, who understands. This role often forms in response to early experiences of chaos or neglect. You learn to attune to others as a way to survive. Over time, healing others became who you are. Letting go of this identity can feel like betrayal. But Buddhism teaches that healing offered from identity drains both giver and receiver. The partner role often involves mirroring. You adjust to maintain connection. You shape yourself to fit the relationship. This adaptation can be loving, but when you lose contact with who you are outside the partnership, identity dissolves into the relationship. Buddhism teaches that true connection does not require disappearance. The parent role is deeply emotional. It involves responsibility, care, sacrifice. But when identity fuses with parenthood, fear increases. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of being unnecessary. Buddhism honors parental care but warns against defining the self by outcomes. Children are not extensions of identity. They are beings with their own paths. Roles also provide protection. They tell you how to act so you do not have to face uncertainty. When you know your role, you know what is expected. Letting go of roles removes this certainty. Buddhism teaches that uncertainty is not a flaw in life, it is life. Awakening involves learning to rest in uncertainty without collapsing. When roles dissolve, discomfort arises. You may feel unanchored. You may ask, if I am not this, then who am I? Buddhism does not answer this question with a new label. It invites observation. It asks you to notice what remains when labels fall away. What remains is awareness, the simple knowing of experience, the ability to feel, to perceive, to respond. This awareness was present before roles formed and remains when they dissolve. Buddhism teaches that this awareness is not owned, it is not personal, it is not defined by function. Letting go of roles reveals how much energy was spent maintaining them, monitoring behavior, managing impressions, anticipating needs. When this energy is released, presence deepens. You become more available to the moment rather than to an image. Roles also shape emotional responses. You may feel obligated to be calm, strong, understanding. Letting go allows emotions to arise naturally. Buddhism teaches that emotions are not obstacles. They are experiences to be known without clinging. There is grief in releasing roles, grief for the recognition they brought, grief for the security they provided. Buddhism allows this grief. It sees grief as the natural response to letting go of form. Grief does not mean you made a mistake, it means you cared. There is also fear of being irrelevant. Without roles, you may worry that you no longer matter. Buddhism challenges this fear. Worth is not assigned by function, it arises from being. This being does not diminish when roles change. Letting go of roles also changes relationships. Some people may resist the shift. They were comfortable with who you were to them. Buddhism teaches that resistance is natural when attachment is challenged. It does not mean the change is wrong. As roles dissolve, authenticity increases. You respond based on what is needed, not on what is expected. This flexibility is a sign of wisdom. Buddhism values responsiveness over rigidity. There is also humility in releasing roles. You accept that you are not essential in the way you once believed. This humility is not loss, it is freedom. It allows others to step into their own capacities. Without fixed roles, compassion becomes more fluid. You help without needing to be the helper. You care without needing to be the caretaker. This reduces ego more effectively than self-denial. Letting go of roles also reduces fear of failure. If you are not your role, you cannot fail at being yourself. Buddhism teaches that failure belongs to tasks, not to being. This release opens space for curiosity. You begin to explore what you enjoy, what you value, what feels true without reference to duty. Buddhism encourages this exploration because it brings you closer to direct experience. The true self in Buddhism is not a thing to find. It is the absence of fixation. It is the freedom to experience without clinging. When roles dissolve, this freedom becomes visible. You may notice a quieter confidence emerging, not confidence based on competence but on presence. You trust yourself to respond because you are not bound to an image. Letting go of roles does not remove you from life. It places you more fully in it. You engage without armor, you act without performance. There is simplicity here. You do what is needed. You rest when it is not. You do not carry identities forward unnecessarily. Buddhism teaches that simplicity reduces suffering. As roles loosen and identity no longer needs constant maintenance, something quieter takes their place. Not excitement, not certainty, but steadiness. A steadiness that feels unfamiliar in a world that rewards urgency and struggle. This is where a deeper understanding begins to form, one that challenges the idea that inner peace is optional or self-centered, and reveals it as something far more consequential. Inner peace is often misunderstood as withdrawal, as calm detached from responsibility, as a private luxury reserved for those with fewer burdens. Buddhism turns this belief inside out. It teaches that inner peace is not an escape from the world, but one of the most ethical contributions you can make to it. Every action begins in the mind. Every word, every reaction, every decision arises from an internal state. When the mind is agitated, fearful, resentful, or exhausted, that state does not stay contained. It leaks, it shapes tone, it influences behavior, it spreads tension quietly. Buddhism teaches that suffering is contagious, not because people intend harm, but because unexamined inner states ripple outward. When you neglect your own peace, you do not suffer alone. Your unrest enters conversations, it colors relationships, it influences choices. Even silence carries it. Inner turmoil becomes shared turmoil, often without words. Buddhism understands this deeply. This is why tending to inner peace is not indulgence. It is responsibility. Many people believe they must sacrifice peace to be useful. That calm means complacency. That rest means disengagement. Buddhism rejects this false trade-off. It teaches that clarity increases effectiveness. A peaceful mind responds more wisely. It sees more clearly. It creates less unnecessary harm. Inner peace is not passivity, it is regulation. It allows you to act without reactivity, to speak without aggression, to listen without defensiveness. In this way, peace becomes an ethical stance. You reduce harm simply by reducing internal chaos. Collective suffering is built from countless individual moments of unexamined reaction. Sharp words spoken from fatigue, decisions made from fear, boundaries ignored from guilt. None of these moments are dramatic on their own. Together, they form patterns of harm. Buddhism teaches that reducing suffering begins at its smallest point of origin, the mind. There is a moral misunderstanding that caring for yourself takes resources away from others. Buddhism reframes this. When you tend to your own peace, you increase your capacity to be present. Presence is not a limited resource, it multiplies. One regulated person can stabilize a room. One grounded response can interrupt escalation. Inner peace also affects how you hold disagreement. Without peace, disagreement feels threatening. You defend, you argue, you withdraw. With peace, disagreement becomes information. You can stay engaged without losing yourself. Buddhism values this ability because it prevents division from hardening into hostility. There is also a difference between urgency and importance. A restless mind confuses the two. Everything feels immediate. Everything demands reaction. Buddhism teaches discernment. Peace allows you to see what truly matters. This discernment reduces unnecessary action, which reduces unnecessary harm. When inner peace is absent, even good intentions can cause damage. You may help compulsively. You may fix without listening. You may push when space is needed. Buddhism teaches that intention must be supported by clarity. Peace provides that clarity. There is a nervous system dimension to this. A dysregulated system transmits stress through tone, posture, pacing. Others feel it even if they cannot name it. When you regulate yourself, you reduce this transmission. Buddhism recognizes this embodied impact long before modern psychology named it. Inner peace also protects against moral exhaustion. Many people burn out trying to care about everything. Buddhism teaches that equanimity is essential. Equanimity does not mean indifference. It means caring without being consumed. This preserves compassion over time. There is also honesty in tending to peace. You stop pretending you can function well while depleted. You acknowledge limits. Buddhism teaches that ignoring limits creates suffering, not strength. Peace grows when limits are respected. Inner peace reduces the urge to control. When you are calm, you do not need to manage outcomes as aggressively. You trust process more. This trust reduces conflict. Buddhism teaches that clinging to control is a major source of suffering. Peace loosens this grip. There is a social impact to this. Calm people do not escalate situations unnecessarily. They listen longer. They pause before responding. These small pauses change dynamics. They slow harm. Buddhism sees this as right action emerging naturally from right mind. Tending to peace also challenges cultural conditioning. Many societies reward stress. They equate busyness with worth. Buddhism questions this deeply. A peaceful person resists harmful norms simply by living differently. Inner peace is also essential for ethical clarity. When the mind is overwhelmed, ethical decisions become reactive. You choose what relieves pressure rather than what aligns with values. Peace allows values to guide action. There is also courage required here. Choosing peace may disappoint others. It may slow productivity. It may challenge expectations. Buddhism teaches that courage is not loud. It is the willingness to stay aligned even when misunderstood. Peace also improves boundaries. When you are calm, you can say no without hostility. You can disengage without resentment. This reduces relational harm. Buddhism values boundaries because they protect conditions for awakening. Inner peace is not permanent. Buddhism does not promise constant calm. It teaches practice. Peace is tended, not possessed. Each moment of awareness contributes. Each return to the present reduces suffering incrementally. There is also humility in peace. You accept that you cannot fix everything. You focus on what you can influence, your responses. Buddhism teaches that this focus is liberating. When you tend to your peace, you model something powerful. Others see that it is possible to be present without chaos. This modeling has impact beyond words. Buddhism understands the power of example. Peace also creates space for wisdom to arise. Insight requires stillness. Without peace, the mind is too busy defending to see clearly. Buddhism places peace as a foundation for understanding, not as an outcome. Inner peace reduces collective suffering not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Through fewer reactive moments, through less emotional harm, through more clarity. There is also self-respect in tending to peace. You acknowledge that your inner life matters. Buddhism teaches that denying this is a form of ignorance. Awareness begins with respect for experience. As peace deepens, actions simplify. You do less, but what you do is more aligned. Buddhism values this simplicity because it reduces error. Tending to peace also prepares you for uncertainty. A calm mind can face change without collapse. This resilience reduces panic-driven harm. Inner peace is not a withdrawal from moral responsibility. It is its foundation. Without it, responsibility becomes reactive and rigid. With it, responsibility becomes responsive and humane. As inner peace becomes something you actively tend, rather than something you chase, a quiet conflict often appears, not inside you, but between you and the world. You feel clearer, calmer, more honest, and yet something feels unsettled. Not because you are wrong, but because you are no longer performing in ways others expect. This is where another truth asks for courage, the courage to stand steady when you are no longer understood. Being misunderstood is one of the deepest fears people carry. Not because misunderstanding is painful on its own, but because it threatens belonging. From early on, approval becomes associated with safety. Being seen correctly feels like being protected. Buddhism recognizes this fear, but it also teaches that clinging to approval is a form of attachment that quietly erodes freedom. Inner alignment often disrupts external harmony. When you begin to live from truth rather than habit, your choices change. Your pace changes. Your priorities shift. To those who benefited from the old version of you, this can feel confusing or even threatening. Buddhism does not promise that alignment will be comfortable for others. It promises that it will be honest. Social approval is powerful because it reflects identity back to us. When others agree with who we think we are, that image feels solid. When they don't, the image cracks. Buddhism teaches that this image was never solid to begin with. It was a collection of perceptions, constantly changing. Seeking approval is an attempt to stabilize what cannot be stabilized. Being misunderstood often triggers the urge to explain, defend, or correct. You want to clarify your intentions. You want to be seen accurately. Buddhism does not say this desire is wrong. It simply points out its cost. When your peace depends on being understood, your inner state becomes fragile. Anyone's opinion can disturb it. The practice of Buddhism places greater value on inner alignment than external agreement because alignment reduces suffering at its root. When you act in accordance with clarity and compassion, you may still cause disappointment, but you do not cause inner division. Inner division is where suffering multiplies. Misunderstanding becomes especially difficult when it comes from people you care about. Family, friends, colleagues, people whose opinions once shaped your choices. Buddhism acknowledges this pain. It does not minimize it. It simply asks a deeper question. Is it better to be understood while betraying yourself or misunderstood while remaining whole? Inner alignment often means you stop participating in familiar narratives. You no longer explain yourself the same way. You no longer react the same way. Others may project meanings onto your silence or your boundaries. Buddhism teaches that projections belong to the projector. You do not have to carry them. The courage to be misunderstood is not about rebellion. It is not about proving a point. It is about non-attachment. When you release the need for approval, you stop grasping at how you are perceived. This release creates space. In that space, you can respond rather than perform. Buddhist practice emphasizes right intention. Intention is internal. It is known directly only by you. Others see actions filtered through their own conditioning. Expecting universal understanding ignores impermanence and difference. Buddhism teaches that understanding is conditioned. It arises and fades. There is also humility in being misunderstood. You accept that you do not control the narrative. You allow others to think what they think. This humility dissolves ego more effectively than trying to manage perception. Being misunderstood often brings loneliness, not physical isolation, but a sense of not being met. Buddhism does not rush to fix this loneliness. It sees it as part of releasing dependency. When approval loosens, a quieter companionship emerges, the companionship of being at ease with yourself. Many people confuse being misunderstood with being wrong. Buddhism separates these. You can be aligned and still be misunderstood. Truth does not require consensus. History is full of examples where clarity preceded acceptance. Inner alignment also simplifies decision-making. You stop checking in with imagined reactions. You listen inwardly. This does not make choices easy, but it makes them clear. Buddhism values clarity over comfort because clarity reduces regret. The fear of misunderstanding often keeps people silent. They withhold truth to maintain image. Buddhism teaches that right speech includes timeliness and care, but it does not include self-erasure. Silence chosen from fear is not peace, it is suppression. There is also a bodily experience to being misunderstood. Tightness, heat, constriction. Buddhism teaches mindfulness of the body precisely because these sensations reveal attachment. When you feel them and stay present, the attachment weakens. Being misunderstood can activate old wounds, memories of rejection, shame, exclusion. Buddhism encourages compassion here. These reactions are conditioned responses. They do not define the present moment. Inner alignment does not mean indifference to others. It means honesty without dependency. You can care deeply and still allow misunderstanding. Buddhism teaches that care without clinging is the middle way. There is freedom in no longer rehearsing how you will be perceived. Mental energy returns, creativity opens, presence deepens. Buddhism sees this as the natural result of releasing attachment to reputation. Misunderstanding also reveals who relates to you through role rather than presence. When you change, some connections weaken. This is not loss in the Buddhist sense. It is impermanence revealing truth. The courage to be misunderstood grows with practice. Each time you choose alignment over approval, confidence stabilizes. Not confidence in being right, but confidence in being honest. Buddhist monks and practitioners throughout history accepted misunderstanding as part of the path, not because they sought it, but because truth often disrupts comfort. This acceptance was not dramatic. It was steady. Being misunderstood also teaches patience. You learn to let time work. Some misunderstandings resolve naturally, others do not. Buddhism teaches that clinging to resolution creates suffering. Allowing uncertainty creates ease. Inner alignment reduces the urge to persuade. You stop needing others to agree. You trust that living truthfully is enough. This trust is quiet but strong. There is also relief when you realize you do not have to be seen correctly by everyone. This relief softens the heart. It reduces defensiveness. Buddhism teaches that defensiveness is a sign of attachment. As approval loses its grip, compassion deepens. You understand that others act from their own conditioning. Misunderstanding becomes less personal. This understanding reduces resentment. The courage to be misunderstood does not make you rigid. It makes you flexible. You can listen without collapsing. You can adjust without betraying yourself. Buddhism values this flexibility because it reflects non-attachment. There will still be moments when misunderstanding hurts. Buddhism does not promise immunity. It promises capacity, the capacity to feel without being consumed. Inner alignment becomes a refuge here. When you know you acted from clarity, external reactions lose some of their power. This is not superiority, it is steadiness. As the courage to be misunderstood settles into the body, another pattern quietly comes into view. A pattern that once felt noble, even healing. One that earned gratitude, praise, and a sense of purpose. And yet beneath it, something remains untouched. This is where the next truth begins to surface, not to accuse, but to clarify. Helping others is often seen as the highest expression of goodness. It gives life meaning. It connects you to something larger than yourself. Buddhism honors compassion deeply, but it also asks a question that is rarely asked. Are you helping because you are present, or because you are avoiding something within yourself? There is a subtle difference between service that arises from clarity and service that arises from discomfort. When helping is grounded in awareness, it feels steady. It does not rush. It does not drain. When helping is used as distraction, it feels urgent, compulsive, necessary. You feel uneasy when you are not useful. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. Silence feels empty. Altruism becomes avoidance when it keeps attention permanently outward. You are always responding, fixing, supporting. There is no room left to notice your own emotions. Buddhism teaches that avoidance is not always obvious. Sometimes it looks like virtue. Many people discover early that helping others earns safety. Praise replaces criticism. Gratitude replaces neglect. Over time, being helpful becomes a strategy. You stay busy so you do not have to feel. You focus on others so you do not have to turn inward. Buddhism does not judge this strategy. It simply points out that what protects you once can imprison you later. When helping becomes a way to avoid yourself, inner questions are postponed indefinitely. Questions about desire, about sadness, about anger, about meaning. There is always someone else who needs attention more. Buddhism teaches that postponing self-awareness does not erase suffering, it delays it. There is often fear beneath this pattern. Fear of what might surface if you stop. Fear of emptiness. Fear of grief. Fear of not knowing who you are without being needed. Helping keeps these fears at bay. It provides structure. It gives identity. Buddhism teaches that identity built on avoidance is fragile. Altruism, used as distraction, also creates dependency. Others come to rely on you not just for help, but for regulation. You become the stabilizer. This may feel important, but it also prevents others from developing their own capacity. Buddhism teaches that compassion supports autonomy, not reliance. There is also exhaustion that comes from this pattern. You may feel tired but unable to rest, guilty when you slow down. Rest feels undeserved. Buddhism sees this guilt as conditioning. You learn that worth comes from usefulness. This belief turns helping into obligation. Helping as avoidance often lacks boundaries. You say yes automatically. You overextend. You ignore signals of fatigue. Buddhism teaches that ignoring the body is a form of ignorance. The body is where truth speaks first. There is also emotional numbness that can develop. When your attention is always outward, your inner world becomes unfamiliar. You may struggle to name your own feelings. Buddhism teaches that emotional awareness is essential for awakening. Without it, compassion becomes mechanical. Another sign of this pattern is discomfort with receiving. When you help to avoid yourself, receiving brings attention back to you. It exposes vulnerability. Buddhism teaches that giving and receiving are two sides of the same flow. Blocking one blocks the other. Helping others can also provide moral cover. As long as you are doing good, you do not have to examine your own pain. Buddhism challenges this gently. Good actions do not replace awareness. They must be accompanied by it. There is also fear of being ordinary beneath compulsive helping. Helping makes you special, needed, different. Without it, you may feel invisible. Buddhism teaches that craving specialness is another form of ego. Awakening involves becoming ordinary in the deepest sense. When altruism becomes avoidance, compassion becomes restless. You rush to help before being asked. You fix problems that are not yours. Buddhism teaches that wisdom knows when not to act. Non-action can be as compassionate as action. There is often resistance to acknowledging this pattern because it threatens identity. If you are not the helper, who are you? Buddhism welcomes this uncertainty. It sees it as fertile ground for insight. Turning inward after years of outward focus can feel uncomfortable. Emotions may surface abruptly. Grief that was delayed, anger that was suppressed. Buddhism teaches that this surfacing is not regression. It is release. Helping others as avoidance also affects relationships. You may feel resentful when help is not appreciated, hurt when it is no longer needed. Buddhism teaches that these reactions reveal attachment. True compassion leaves no residue. There is also a subtle form of control in compulsive helping. By fixing others, you avoid facing your own lack of control. Buddhism teaches that control is illusory. Letting go of it brings peace. Recognizing altruism as distraction does not mean stopping all help. It means changing your relationship to it. Helping becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Buddhism values choice because it arises from awareness. When you allow yourself to stop helping temporarily, something important happens. Attention returns inward. You begin to notice sensations, thoughts, emotions that were bypassed. Buddhism teaches that this noticing is the beginning of freedom. There may be discomfort here, boredom, restlessness, a sense of emptiness. Buddhism does not rush to fill this emptiness. It allows it to be felt. Emptiness is not lack, it is space. In that space, self-awareness grows. You begin to understand why you helped the way you did, not with blame, but with compassion. Buddhism teaches self-compassion as part of wisdom. Helping others from a place of presence feels different. There is no urgency, no depletion. You help when asked. You stop when tired. You trust others to handle their lives. Buddhism teaches that trust is essential for non-attachment. When altruism is no longer used as avoidance, relationships become more balanced. You meet others as equals, not as projects. Buddhism teaches that equality reduces suffering. This shift also restores creativity. When energy is no longer consumed by constant helping, it becomes available for exploration. Joy returns. Curiosity awakens. Buddhism includes joy as part of the path. You may also notice resistance from others when you change this pattern. They were used to your availability. Buddhism teaches that resistance is part of impermanence. It does not mean you are wrong. Recognizing altruism as distraction is a mature insight. It does not diminish kindness, it refines it. Buddhism teaches that refined compassion is guided by clarity. Helping others without avoiding yourself allows you to be present with your own life. You stop living through others' needs. you begin to live directly. Buddhism sees this as essential for awakening. As attention turns back from constant helping and settles more fully inside, another deeply praised habit begins to stand out, one that has been mistaken for strength for generations, one that is often rewarded, admired, and encouraged, the habit of enduring quietly. This is where a long-held misunderstanding begins to loosen. Silent suffering is often treated as noble, staying quiet, holding it together, carrying pain without complaint. Many people were taught that this is maturity, that resilience means not needing anything, that strength means enduring without expression. Buddhism does not agree. It sees silent suffering not as virtue, but as a misunderstanding of the path. Endurance is not inherently wrong. There are moments in life where patience is necessary, where discomfort must be met without immediate escape. Buddhism teaches patience as a skill. But patience is not suppression. Endurance becomes harmful when it turns into a habit of ignoring pain rather than understanding it. The habit of endurance usually forms early. You learn that expressing pain creates problems, that voicing discomfort burdens others, that silence keeps things stable. Over time, you stop checking whether endurance is still necessary. It becomes automatic. Buddhism teaches that automatic responses are conditioned, not wise. Silent suffering often looks calm from the outside. Inside, it is tight. There is tension held in the jaw, the chest, the stomach. The body holds what the voice does not express. Buddhism teaches that the body is not separate from the mind. Pain unacknowledged in the mind will appear in the body. There is also identity attached to endurance. You become the one who can handle anything, the one who does not break, the one who keeps going. This identity feels strong, but it is brittle. It cannot bend. Buddhism teaches that flexibility is strength, rigidity is attachment. Silent suffering often delays healing because it bypasses awareness. You tell yourself it is fine. You minimize pain. You compare yourself to others. Buddhism teaches that comparison distorts perception. Pain is not reduced by comparison. It is reduced by understanding. Many people believe Buddhism glorifies suffering. This is a misunderstanding. Buddhism acknowledges suffering as a fact of life, not as a goal. The Buddha did not teach endurance for its own sake. He taught the end of unnecessary suffering through awareness. Enduring silently often comes from fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as weak. Buddhism teaches that fear is a signal, not a command. When fear dictates behavior, suffering deepens. Silent suffering also keeps relationships shallow. Others cannot respond to what they do not see. When you endure quietly, you deprive relationships of honesty. Buddhism teaches that right speech includes speaking truthfully about suffering when it is appropriate. There is also resentment that builds beneath endurance. You give without asking. You carry without support. Over time, bitterness grows quietly. Buddhism teaches that resentment poisons the mind. It does not stay contained. It leaks into tone, withdrawal, and disengagement. Endurance can become a way to avoid change. If you can endure anything, you never have to decide. You stay because leaving feels disruptive. Buddhism teaches that endurance without wisdom keeps you stuck in patterns that no longer serve awakening. There is a cultural layer to this habit. Many societies reward those who suffer quietly. Productivity is valued over well-being. Buddhism challenges this directly. It teaches that suffering does not prove worth. Awareness does. Silent suffering often disconnects you from compassion toward yourself. You may extend understanding to others while denying it inwardly. Buddhism teaches self-compassion as part of wisdom. Ignoring your own pain does not make you kinder. It makes you harder. Endurance also affects perception of time. When you endure rather than address pain, life feels heavy. Days blend together. There is a sense of waiting for relief that never comes. Buddhism teaches that presence dissolves this waiting. Endurance without presence stretches suffering across time. There is also a misunderstanding that speaking about pain means being consumed by it. Buddhism teaches the opposite. Naming suffering clearly is the first step toward its release. Suppression keeps it alive. Healing the habit of endurance requires listening to the body, listening to emotions, listening to fatigue. Buddhism teaches mindfulness precisely because it restores this listening. Awareness brings pain into the light where it can change. There may be guilt when you stop enduring silently, guilt for needing help, guilt for speaking up. Buddhism recognizes this guilt as conditioning. It arises when old patterns are challenged. It does not mean you are wrong. Endurance often feels safer than vulnerability. Vulnerability risks disappointment. Endurance feels controlled. Buddhism teaches that control is illusory. True safety comes from alignment, not from suppression. Silent suffering also limits joy. When pain is always held in, pleasure feels undeserved. Buddhism includes joy as part of the path. Joy is not attachment, it is a sign of openness. There is also fatigue that comes from constant endurance, not just physical fatigue, but existential tiredness, a sense of carrying life rather than living it. Buddhism teaches that life is to be experienced, not endured. Healing this habit does not mean reacting to every discomfort. It means discerning when endurance is appropriate and when it is avoidance. Buddhism emphasizes discernment as central to wisdom. As endurance softens, expression becomes possible. You speak more honestly, you ask for support, you set limits. This does not make you weaker, it makes you accurate. Others may resist this change. They were used to your silence. Buddhism teaches that resistance is part of impermanence. It does not indicate error. Letting go of silent suffering also restores trust in yourself. You learn that your pain matters. Buddhism teaches that dismissing pain is a form of ignorance. Respecting it is the beginning of insight. There is also relief when endurance is no longer required as proof of strength. You stop proving. You start living. Buddhism sees this as movement toward liberation. Healing the habit of endurance also interrupts generational patterns. When you stop glorifying silent suffering, you model a different way of being. Buddhism understands the ripple effect of awareness. Endurance without awareness keeps suffering static. Endurance with awareness becomes patience. The difference is listening. As this habit loosens, energy returns. Not explosive energy, but steadiness. The steadiness that comes from not fighting your own experience. Buddhism does not ask you to suffer silently. It asks you to see suffering clearly so it can end. As silent suffering loosens its grip and endurance is no longer mistaken for strength, a new concern often appears. Not about whether you deserve care, but about what that care might cost. A worry that choosing yourself means standing alone. This is where another misunderstanding waits to be untangled. There is a quiet fear that honoring your needs will separate you from others, that setting boundaries will lead to distance, that self-respect will turn into isolation. Buddhism addresses this fear with clarity. It teaches that disconnection does not come from choosing yourself. It comes from choosing yourself without awareness of relationship. Isolation and solitude are not the same. Isolation is disconnection without choice. Solitude is space with intention. In the same way, choosing yourself can either harden into withdrawal or soften into honest connection. The difference lies in motivation. When you choose yourself out of anger, exhaustion, or resentment, withdrawal often follows. You pull back sharply. You close off. This can feel necessary in the moment, but it often leaves a residue of loneliness. Buddhism does not judge this response. It simply points out that reactivity narrows connection. Choosing yourself with awareness looks different. It involves clarity rather than defense. You recognize your needs without turning them into walls. You set limits without punishing others. Buddhism teaches that wisdom allows separation without severing. Connection does not require constant availability. Many people confuse closeness with access. Buddhism challenges this assumption. True connection is based on presence, not proximity. You can be deeply connected without being constantly involved. When you honor your needs, communication becomes essential. Not excessive explanation, but honest signaling. You let others know where you are without justifying it. This transparency reduces confusion. Buddhism values clarity because it prevents unnecessary suffering. Choosing yourself without becoming isolated also requires patience. Others may need time to adjust. They were used to an older version of you. Buddhism teaches impermanence. Relationships evolve. Adjustment is part of that evolution. There is also trust involved. Trust that connection can survive boundaries. Trust that relationships built on mutual respect will adapt. Buddhism teaches trust as an aspect of non-attachment. You allow things to unfold without forcing outcomes. Isolation often arises when boundaries are set abruptly without inner alignment. If boundaries come from unresolved hurt, they may feel rigid. Buddhism encourages meeting hurt directly, so boundaries can be flexible rather than defensive. Remaining connected while choosing yourself also means staying emotionally available. You may not meet every request, but you remain open to listening. Buddhism teaches that openness is not the same as compliance. Choosing yourself does not mean centering yourself constantly. It means including yourself in the field of care. Buddhism teaches interdependence. Self and other are not in competition. Caring for one does not require neglecting the other. Many people fear that if they stop overgiving, they will be forgotten. Buddhism teaches that overgiving does not guarantee connection. Authentic presence does. When you show up honestly, connection deepens even if frequency changes. There is also vulnerability here. Choosing yourself may reveal differences. You may discover that some connections relied on your self-neglect. This can be painful. Buddhism teaches that pain reveals truth. Truth allows real connection to form. Isolation often comes from silence, from pulling away without sharing inner reality. Choosing yourself with awareness includes letting others know what is happening internally, when appropriate. This keeps bridges intact. Remaining connected also involves listening to others' experiences without taking responsibility for them. You can care without fixing. Buddhism teaches that this balance preserves connection without self-erasure. Choosing yourself can actually improve relationships. When resentment fades, interactions become lighter. When obligation dissolves, presence increases. Buddhism teaches that freedom strengthens connection. There is also discernment required. Not every relationship can meet you where you are going. Buddhism teaches discernment as wisdom, not judgment. Letting some connections loosen is not isolation. It is alignment. Staying connected does not mean staying the same. Growth changes dynamics. Buddhism teaches that clinging to sameness creates suffering. Allowing change reduces it. Choosing yourself without becoming isolated also requires self-compassion. You may make mistakes. You may pull back too much or not enough. Buddhism teaches that learning happens through experience, not perfection. Connection is not maintained by sacrifice. It is maintained by authenticity. Buddhism emphasizes authenticity because it reflects reality rather than performance. There is also courage involved. Staying connected while honoring yourself means allowing discomfort on both sides. Buddhism teaches that discomfort is not a sign of harm. It is often a sign of growth. Choosing yourself can create space for others to choose themselves. When you stop carrying everything, others may step forward. Buddhism teaches that shared responsibility strengthens community. Isolation often stems from fear of conflict. Choosing yourself with awareness includes allowing disagreement. Buddhism teaches that harmony does not require agreement. It requires respect. Remaining connected also means staying curious. Curious about others' responses. Curious about your own reactions. Buddhism values curiosity because it keeps the heart open. Choosing yourself without isolation is a practice, not a one-time decision. Each interaction offers a chance to balance honesty and care. Buddhism emphasizes practice because balance is dynamic. There may be moments of loneliness. These moments are not failure. They are transitions. Buddhism teaches that transitions feel uncertain before they feel stable. Connection that survives your authenticity is resilient. Connection that requires your disappearance is fragile. Buddhism teaches that resilience reduces suffering over time. Choosing yourself allows you to show up more fully when you do engage. You are not depleted, you are not resentful. Presence becomes possible. Buddhism sees presence as the ground of compassion. Isolation decreases when you stop assuming that boundaries push people away. Often, they invite respect. Buddhism teaches that respect is the basis of right relationship. Staying connected also means accepting that not everyone will understand your choices. This does not require withdrawal, it requires steadiness. Buddhism teaches steadiness as equanimity. Choosing yourself without becoming isolated restores dignity. You are no longer trading connection for self-abandonment. Buddhism teaches that dignity supports awakening. As the balance between honoring yourself and staying connected becomes steadier, another quiet knowing begins to surface. A sense that staying too long changes something inside, that waiting past a certain point hardens the heart. This is where timing reveals itself not as impatience, but as wisdom. There is a common belief that leaving should only happen when things are unbearable, when anger explodes, when resentment is obvious, when damage is undeniable. Buddhism offers a gentler and more precise understanding. It teaches that wisdom often means leaving before bitterness forms, not after it has already taken root. Bitterness does not arrive suddenly. It grows slowly. It begins as mild discomfort, a small tightening in the chest, a hesitation before responding, a quiet dread that appears before certain interactions. These early signals are often ignored in the name of loyalty, patience, or hope. Buddhism teaches that ignoring early signals is how suffering deepens. Timing matters because the mind changes with prolonged misalignment. When you stay beyond your capacity, awareness narrows, compassion thins. You may still act kindly, but effort replaces sincerity. Over time, kindness becomes heavy. This heaviness is the soil where bitterness grows. Leaving early is often misunderstood as avoidance or selfishness. Buddhism reframes it as care, care for yourself, care for the relationship, care for what remains unspoken. Leaving before resentment forms preserves clarity. It allows separation without hostility. Bitterness alters perception. When it takes hold, you no longer see situations clearly. You interpret through accumulated hurt. Words feel sharper. Intentions feel suspect. Buddhism teaches that bitterness is a form of delusion. It distorts reality by filtering everything through pain. When you leave before bitterness forms, you leave with awareness intact. You can still recognize what was good. You can still feel gratitude. You can still hold respect. Leaving later often means leaving with anger, which binds you longer than staying ever did. There is also a karmic dimension to timing. Actions taken from clarity carry different momentum than actions taken from resentment. Buddhism teaches that intention shapes outcome. Leaving from awareness creates release. Leaving from bitterness creates residue that follows you forward. Many people wait to leave because they fear regret. They think enduring longer will protect them from doubt. Buddhism teaches the opposite. Staying past alignment often creates deeper regret. Not regret for leaving, but regret for ignoring inner wisdom. Bitterness also harms relationships beyond repair. When resentment accumulates, communication collapses. Even small issues trigger large reactions. Buddhism teaches that once the mind is saturated with aversion, skillful action becomes difficult. Leaving earlier preserves the possibility of respect, even if closeness ends. Timing also protects your nervous system. Prolonged misalignment keeps the system in a state of tension. This tension becomes baseline. Buddhism recognizes the body as an instrument of awareness. When it is strained too long, insight dulls. Leaving before bitterness forms requires trust. Trust in your inner signals. Trust that you do not need to reach a breaking point to justify change. Buddhism teaches that wisdom does not wait for collapse. It responds to subtlety. There is often guilt associated with early leaving. Guilt for not trying harder. Guilt for disappointing others. Buddhism understands this guilt as conditioning. It arises when you break from familiar patterns. It does not indicate wrongdoing. Bitterness is also contagious. When you stay while resentful, it spreads. Tone shifts. Patience shortens. Others feel it even if nothing is said. Leaving earlier prevents this transmission. Buddhism teaches that reducing suffering includes reducing the spread of resentment. There is a misconception that endurance proves love. Buddhism challenges this. Love does not require self-destruction. Love includes discernment. Leaving early can be an act of love when staying would poison what remains. Timing also affects how you carry experiences forward. When you leave with clarity, you integrate lessons more gently. When you leave with bitterness, lessons harden into defenses. Buddhism teaches that defenses limit future connection. Many people wait for certainty before leaving. Buddhism teaches that certainty is rare. Wisdom often acts with partial information but clear alignment. Waiting for certainty can be another form of avoidance. Leaving before bitterness forms does not mean leaving at the first sign of discomfort. It means paying attention to patterns, repeated signals, persistent misalignment. Buddhism teaches discernment, not impulsivity. There is also humility in leaving early. You accept that you cannot fix everything, that some situations do not improve with effort. Buddhism teaches that acceptance reduces suffering more effectively than struggle. Bitterness often arises when you override your own limits. When you say yes while feeling no. Leaving early honors limits before they are violated repeatedly. Buddhism sees honoring limits as wisdom, not weakness. Timing also shapes memory. How you remember a chapter of your life depends on how it ended. Leaving with respect allows memories to remain balanced. Leaving with bitterness often rewrites the entire story through pain. Buddhism teaches that perception is shaped by final impressions. There is also freedom in not waiting for permission to leave. Buddhism teaches that liberation does not require consensus. You do not need agreement to act wisely. Leaving early preserves your capacity for compassion. When you stay too long, compassion burns out. Leaving allows compassion to remain intact, even if from a distance. Bitterness is heavy to carry. It follows you into new situations, new relationships, new roles. Buddhism teaches that what is not resolved travels. Leaving before bitterness forms prevents unnecessary baggage. Timing also reflects self-respect. You recognize that your well-being matters enough to act before damage occurs. Buddhism teaches that respecting experience is essential for awakening. There may be fear that leaving early means giving up too soon. Buddhism distinguishes between giving up and letting go. Giving up is collapse. Letting go is clarity. Timing determines the difference. Leaving before bitterness forms allows grief to be clean. You grieve the ending without anger distorting the process. Buddhism allows grief. It does not glorify resentment. There is also trust in life involved. Trust that endings create space for beginnings. Buddhism teaches impermanence not as loss, but as movement. Timing aligns you with this movement. Leaving early also models wisdom. Others may not understand immediately. Over time, clarity often speaks for itself. Buddhism teaches patience in this regard. Bitterness often locks you into narratives of blame. Leaving earlier reduces the need to blame. You can see complexity without hardening. Buddhism values complexity because it reflects reality. Timing matters because awareness has windows. Moments when clarity is available. When you sense the shift but before resentment sets in. Acting in these windows preserves freedom. Leaving before bitterness forms is not dramatic. It is often quiet. A gradual stepping back, a clear decision. Buddhism teaches that quiet actions often have the deepest impact. There is also relief when you do not have to carry anger to justify leaving. You do not need to be wronged to choose differently. Buddhism teaches that alignment is enough reason. Bitterness consumes energy. Leaving early conserves it. That energy can be used for healing, growth, and presence. Buddhism sees this conservation as wise use of life force. Timing also shapes forgiveness. Forgiving without bitterness is possible. Forgiving with bitterness is forced. Buddhism teaches that forgiveness arises naturally when resentment is absent. Leaving early honors both truth and kindness. You do not sacrifice one for the other. Buddhism teaches that wisdom holds both. As the wisdom of timing settles and the weight of bitterness is avoided rather than carried, something quieter becomes noticeable. A sense that the most important guide was never outside of you, that every step toward freedom depended on something you were taught to doubt. This is where the path turns inward in a deeper way, toward the ground on which all liberation stands. Self-trust is rarely spoken of as spiritual. It is often framed as confidence, instinct, or personality. Buddhism sees it differently. It sees self-trust as the willingness to take your own experience seriously, to believe what you feel before it is approved, to listen to what arises within you before it is explained away. Awakening does not begin with certainty. It begins with honesty. Many people live disconnected from their own experience, not because they are unaware, but because they were trained to distrust what they feel. You were taught that emotions are unreliable, that discomfort is weakness, that intuition must be justified. Over time, you learn to look outward for confirmation before acting inwardly. Buddhism names this as a core form of ignorance. Believing your inner experience does not mean assuming it is always right. It means recognizing it as real. When sadness appears, it is real. When resistance arises, it is real. When clarity arrives quietly, it is real. Buddhism teaches that awakening requires meeting reality as it is, not as it should be. Your inner experience is part of that reality. Self-trust begins with noticing without dismissal. You stop saying it's nothing when something is clearly present. You stop minimizing discomfort. You stop explaining away tension. This noticing is not dramatic, it is simple, and it is powerful because it restores connection to direct experience. Many people confuse self-trust with ego. Buddhism makes a clear distinction. Ego insists, self-trust listens. Ego demands certainty. Self-trust allows uncertainty while staying grounded. Ego defends identity. Self-trust stays curious. Liberation does not require believing every thought. It requires trusting the process of awareness itself. When self-trust is absent, you hesitate constantly. You second-guess decisions. You look for external permission. This hesitation creates suffering because it fragments action. Buddhism teaches that fragmented action weakens clarity. When you trust your experience, action becomes simpler, even when outcomes are unknown. Awakening is not about acquiring new beliefs. It is about releasing doubt toward what is already known. Buddhism emphasizes direct knowing. You know when something feels wrong. You know when something aligns. This knowing is often subtle. Self-trust is the willingness to honor it without demanding proof. Many people wait for certainty before acting. Buddhism teaches that certainty is rare. Impermanence means conditions are always shifting. Self-trust allows movement without certainty. It does not require guarantees. It requires presence. There is fear around trusting yourself, fear of making mistakes, fear of being wrong. Buddhism reframes mistakes. They are not failures. They are teachers. When you trust your experience, you learn faster because feedback is integrated rather than denied. Self-trust also heals fragmentation. When you consistently override your inner signals, parts of you retreat. You become divided. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from division. Trust restores wholeness by bringing attention back to what was ignored. Believing your inner experience also reduces dependency. You no longer need constant reassurance. You consult others, but you do not abandon yourself in the process. Buddhism teaches interdependence, not dependence. Self-trust allows healthy interdependence to form. There is also a bodily aspect to self-trust. The body communicates through sensation, tightness, ease, fatigue, energy. When you trust these signals, you align action with reality. Buddhism teaches mindfulness of the body because the body does not lie. It responds directly to conditions. Self-trust does not make you rigid. It makes you responsive. When new information arises, you adjust. Trusting yourself includes trusting your ability to learn. Buddhism teaches that wisdom is dynamic, not fixed. Awakening requires intimacy with experience. Without self-trust, you stay distant. You observe life from a distance. With self-trust, you engage fully. Buddhism teaches that engagement with awareness dissolves suffering. There is also grief involved in reclaiming self-trust, grief for the times you ignored yourself, for the moments you stayed silent. Buddhism allows this grief. It sees it as honesty arriving late, not as failure. Self-trust also dismantles people-pleasing at its root. When you believe your experience, others' reactions lose absolute authority. You consider them, but they no longer override truth. Buddhism teaches that this shift is essential for freedom. There is humility in self-trust. You accept that you do not have all answers. You trust the process of unfolding rather than fixed outcomes. Buddhism values humility because it keeps the mind open. Believing your inner experience also clarifies responsibility. You take responsibility for your responses, not for others' perceptions. Buddhism teaches that confusion around responsibility creates suffering. Self-trust brings clarity. Self-trust strengthens boundaries naturally. You do not need rules. You feel when something crosses a line. Buddhism teaches that boundaries rooted in awareness are flexible and humane. There is also calm that grows with self-trust. You stop fighting yourself. Inner conflict decreases. Buddhism sees this calm as a sign of alignment, not withdrawal. Awakening deepens when you trust what arises without immediately trying to change it. You allow experience to unfold. Buddhism teaches that insight arises from allowing, not forcing. Self-trust also reduces fear of impermanence. When you trust yourself, change becomes manageable. You trust your capacity to respond. Buddhism teaches that trust in awareness is the antidote to fear. There is a subtle joy that appears when self-trust returns. Not excitement, but relief. Relief from constant doubt. Buddhism includes joy as a factor of awakening because it signals reduced inner conflict. Trusting yourself does not isolate you. It allows clearer connection. You meet others without needing to disappear. Buddhism teaches that clarity strengthens relationship. Self-trust also protects against burnout. When you listen early, you do not have to collapse later. Buddhism teaches that prevention of suffering is wiser than endurance. Awakening is not a dramatic event. It is a gradual return to trusting what is already here. Self-trust is not arrogance. It is intimacy with reality. As self-trust begins to settle and your inner experience no longer needs constant confirmation, another attachment quietly comes into view, one that often hides behind generosity, loyalty, and care. one that feels loving on the surface, yet quietly limits freedom for everyone involved. This is where a deeper pattern asks to be seen. Being needed can feel like proof of worth. When others rely on you, call you first, lean on you emotionally, or depend on your presence to function, it creates a sense of purpose. It feels grounding, it feels meaningful. Buddhism does not deny this feeling, but it asks an essential question. Does this sense of meaning arise from connection or from fear of being unnecessary? The need to be needed often forms early. In environments where attention, affection, or safety were uncertain, usefulness became currency. You learned that being helpful secured connection, that solving problems earned closeness, that emotional availability made you indispensable. Over time, this strategy hardened into identity. You did not just help, you became the helper. Buddhism teaches that attachment is not limited to possessions or pleasure. Attachment also forms around roles, identities, and emotional functions. Being indispensable can become one of the strongest attachments because it feels virtuous. It disguises itself as love while quietly binding both you and others. When your sense of worth is tied to being needed, relationships lose balance. You may feel uneasy when others grow independent. You may feel threatened by their strength. You may subtly discourage autonomy, not out of malice, but out of fear. Buddhism teaches that any form of fear-driven attachment creates suffering, even when it looks kind. Being needed can also become a way to avoid facing your own emptiness. As long as others require you, you do not have to sit with unanswered questions. You do not have to explore who you are beyond service. Buddhism points out that avoidance often wears noble disguises. There is also pressure in being indispensable. You feel responsible for outcomes that are not yours. You worry about what will happen if you step back. You may stay in roles long past their health because leaving feels like abandonment. Buddhism teaches that responsibility taken beyond its rightful place becomes burden, not care. The need to be needed also creates subtle control. When others depend on you, you hold influence. This influence may never be used consciously, but it exists. Buddhism teaches that control, even unintentional, distorts compassion. True compassion supports freedom, not dependence. Love that requires being needed is conditional. It says, "I matter as long as I am useful." Buddhism challenges this quietly. It teaches that love rooted in non-attachment allows others to change, grow, and even leave without collapse. Love rooted in need clings to stability. Being indispensable can also prevent reciprocity. You give constantly, but receiving feels uncomfortable. Receiving threatens the identity. If you are no longer the strong one, who are you? Buddhism teaches that blocking receiving blocks connection. Giving and receiving are one movement, not two separate roles. There is often resentment beneath the need to be needed. You give more than you want to. You show up even when tired. Over time, you may feel unappreciated. Buddhism teaches that resentment is a sign of misalignment, not ingratitude from others. The need to be needed also narrows identity. You become one-dimensional, the helper, the supporter, the fixer. Other parts of you go unexplored. Buddhism teaches that clinging to narrow identity limits awareness. Liberation requires spaciousness. When you release the need to be needed, fear often arises. Fear of being replaced, fear of being forgotten, fear of not mattering. Buddhism does not dismiss these fears. It invites you to meet them with awareness rather than obedience. Letting go of being indispensable does not mean withdrawing love. It means changing its quality. You care without clinging. You offer without managing. You step back without guilt. Buddhism teaches that this shift reduces suffering on both sides. There is also grief in this release. Grief for the role that gave you structure. Grief for the appreciation that came with it. Buddhism allows this grief. It understands that identity dissolves slowly, not abruptly. Being needed often keeps relationships stuck. Growth threatens the dynamic. When one person evolves, the other may feel lost. Buddhism teaches that clinging to sameness creates suffering. Allowing change supports truth. Releasing the need to be needed also restores equality. You meet others as capable beings, not as dependents. Buddhism values equality because it dissolves hierarchy and ego simultaneously. This release also returns energy. You stop carrying responsibilities that were never yours. You stop anticipating needs that were not asked. Buddhism teaches that conserving life force supports clarity. There is humility required here. You accept that you are not essential to everyone's survival. This humility is not diminishing. It is freeing. Buddhism teaches that freedom arises when you stop inflating or shrinking the self. When the need to be needed loosens, presence improves. You listen without preparing solutions. You respond rather than rescue. Buddhism teaches that true listening is a form of compassion deeper than fixing. You may also notice discomfort in others when you step back. They were used to leaning on you. Buddhism teaches that discomfort is part of adjustment, not proof of harm. Releasing this need also clarifies love. Love becomes choice rather than obligation. You show up because you want to, not because you are required. Buddhism teaches that choice strengthens connection. There is also space that opens when you are no longer indispensable. Space to explore interests, space to rest, space to discover who you are when you are not needed. Buddhism sees this space as fertile ground for insight. Being needed often keeps you oriented toward the past. Old dynamics, old roles. Releasing it allows you to meet the present freshly. Buddhism teaches that presence is where liberation unfolds. You may fear that without being needed, you will be alone. Buddhism teaches that loneliness rooted in self-trust is different from loneliness rooted in rejection. One is spacious, the other is constricting. Letting go of being indispensable also heals patterns of over-functioning. You stop doing more so others can do less. Balance returns. Buddhism teaches balance as central to the middle path. Love without the need to be needed is quieter. It does not demand proof. It does not require reassurance. It trusts connection to breathe. Buddhism teaches that trust dissolves clinging. As this attachment releases, dignity returns. You no longer trade usefulness for belonging. You belong because you are present. Buddhism teaches that dignity supports awakening. This shift does not remove you from relationship. It refines it. You remain connected without entanglement. You care without losing yourself. As the need to be needed loosens and love begins to breathe without obligation, another misunderstanding quietly asks to be corrected. One that has shaped spiritual paths, emotional habits, and countless quiet withdrawals. A misunderstanding that has caused many people to confuse healing with distance and wisdom with coldness. There is a belief that maturity means not feeling, that growth requires detachment, that the spiritual path leads away from emotion rather than through it. Buddhism has often been misread this way. Emotional detachment is praised as clarity, while emotional engagement is seen as weakness. This misunderstanding has caused deep harm, not only to relationships, but to the inner life itself. Emotional detachment is a closing. Emotional maturity is an opening. The two may look similar on the surface, but internally they are opposite movements. Detachment numbs. Maturity allows. Detachment avoids discomfort. Maturity stays present with it. Many people turn toward detachment because emotions feel overwhelming. Pain feels endless. Attachment feels dangerous. Buddhism understands this impulse, but it does not teach escape from feeling. It teaches freedom within feeling. Emotional detachment often forms as protection. When emotions were not welcomed, not understood or punished, withdrawal felt safer. You learned to shut down rather than be hurt again. Over time, this shutdown can be mistaken for calm. Buddhism does not mistake numbness for peace. Peace in Buddhist teaching is alive. It is responsive. It includes emotion without being ruled by it. Emotional maturity allows sadness without drowning, joy without clinging, anger without violence. Detachment avoids all three. There is a subtle pride that can form around emotional detachment. You appear unbothered, untouched, above it all. Others may admire this composure, but inside, something is missing. Buddhism teaches that absence of disturbance is not the same as presence of awareness. Detachment disconnects you from the body. You stop noticing sensations. You override signals. Buddhism emphasizes mindfulness of the body because the body anchors awareness in reality. Emotional maturity listens to the body. Detachment ignores it. Many people believe Buddhism teaches indifference. This is a misunderstanding. Buddhism teaches equanimity, not indifference. Equanimity is balance, not distance. It is the ability to remain present without being pushed or pulled. Detachment steps away. Equanimity stays. Emotional maturity does not suppress emotion. It creates space around it. You feel fully, but you are not consumed. Buddhism teaches that suffering comes not from emotion, but from identification with it. Detachment avoids identification by avoidance. Maturity releases identification through awareness. Detachment often feels controlled. You decide not to feel. You stay composed, but this control comes at a cost. Suppressed emotion does not disappear. It waits. It surfaces later as tension, illness, or sudden outbursts. Buddhism teaches that what is not acknowledged continues unconsciously. Emotional maturity requires courage. Courage to feel without fixing. Courage to stay present without escaping. Buddhism values courage because awareness deepens only when experience is allowed. Detachment also affects relationships. When you withdraw emotionally, connection weakens. Others may feel unseen or shut out. Buddhism teaches compassion as engagement, not distance. Emotional maturity allows closeness without fusion. There is also confusion between non-attachment and detachment. Non-attachment does not mean not caring. It means caring without clinging. Detachment often means not caring to avoid pain. Buddhism distinguishes these carefully. Emotional maturity allows vulnerability. You can admit fear, sadness, longing without collapsing. Detachment avoids vulnerability altogether. Buddhism teaches that vulnerability is not weakness, it is honesty. Many people adopt emotional detachment as a spiritual ideal. They believe enlightenment looks stoic, unmoved. Buddhism does not support this image. The Buddha spoke of compassion, joy, tenderness. Enlightenment is not emotional emptiness. It is emotional freedom. Detachment also limits growth. Without emotional feedback, learning stalls. Emotions carry information. They point to needs, values, boundaries. Buddhism teaches that wisdom integrates this information rather than discarding it. There is also grief behind detachment. Grief that was never processed, pain that was never named. Detachment freezes this grief in place. Emotional maturity allows grief to move. Detachment can feel peaceful in the short term. It reduces immediate discomfort. But long-term, it creates disconnection. Buddhism teaches that true peace is sustainable because it does not require avoidance. Emotional maturity involves regulation, not suppression. You notice emotion, breathe with it, respond skillfully. Buddhism offers practices precisely for this reason. Meditation is not about shutting down. It is about seeing clearly. There is also self-compassion involved. Emotional maturity treats inner experience with kindness. Detachment judges emotion as something to eliminate. Buddhism teaches compassion toward all experience, including pain. Detachment often leads to rigidity. You become fixed in a calm persona. Emotional maturity allows flexibility. You can be serious or playful, quiet or expressive, depending on what is appropriate. Buddhism values responsiveness over fixed states. Another misunderstanding is that emotional maturity means always being calm. Buddhism teaches that calm is one state among many. Maturity means meeting whatever state arises without losing awareness. Detachment can create distance from joy as well as pain. You stop feeling deeply altogether. Buddhism includes joy as a factor of awakening. Joy arises naturally when resistance dissolves. There is also fear beneath detachment, fear of losing control, fear of being overwhelmed. Buddhism addresses fear by building capacity, not avoidance. Emotional maturity increases capacity to feel without collapse. Detachment may look strong, but it is fragile. When life breaks through, the system may not know how to respond. Emotional maturity builds resilience. You have practiced being with difficulty. There is also honesty required. Emotional maturity does not pretend you are unaffected when you are. It allows truth to be present. Buddhism teaches that truthfulness reduces suffering. Detachment often leads to isolation. Others sense distance. Emotional maturity invites connection. You can be present with others' emotions without absorbing them. Buddhism teaches this balance. Emotional maturity also improves boundaries. You know when to engage and when to step back. Detachment withdraws indiscriminately. Buddhism teaches discernment. The body relaxes with emotional maturity. Tension releases, breath deepens. Detachment often holds tension beneath the surface. Buddhism recognizes these somatic signs as indicators of alignment. Emotional maturity does not mean expressing everything. It means allowing everything internally. Expression is chosen wisely. Buddhism teaches right speech, not constant speech. Detachment often feels like safety. Emotional maturity feels like openness. Buddhism teaches that openness, not armor, leads to freedom. There is a quiet confidence that comes with emotional maturity. You trust yourself to feel and survive. Detachment relies on avoidance to feel safe. Buddhism teaches that trust dissolves fear. Emotional maturity allows you to be moved by life without being controlled by it. Detachment refuses to be moved at all. Buddhism honors being touched by life. This maturity also restores intimacy. You can share experience honestly. You can listen without shutting down. Buddhism sees intimacy as part of compassion. Detachment often delays healing. Emotional maturity allows it. Healing happens when experience is met fully. There is also humility in emotional maturity. You accept that you will feel pain again. Buddhism teaches that impermanence includes the return of difficulty. Maturity prepares you for this. Emotional maturity does not make life painless, it makes it workable. Buddhism teaches that workable suffering can end, avoided suffering multiplies. As this misunderstanding clears, the path becomes warmer, more human, more alive, not less spiritual, but more honest. As emotional maturity replaces distance, and the heart no longer needs armor to feel safe, a final understanding begins to unfold, not as an ending, but as a return. A return to the world, not burdened by obligation, not driven by fear, but guided by clarity. This is where choosing yourself reveals its deepest meaning. There is a belief that healing is private. That inner work is something you do for yourself alone. Buddhism offers a wider view. It teaches that a healed individual is not withdrawn from the world, but becomes a quiet gift to it. Not through effort, not through sacrifice, but through presence. When you choose yourself with awareness, you stop leaking unresolved pain into your surroundings. You stop reacting from wounds. You stop asking others to complete what was never theirs to carry. This alone reduces suffering. Not symbolically, but practically. Unhealed people often create obligation around them. They need reassurance. They need validation. They need others to adapt to their unspoken wounds. This is not because they are bad, but because pain seeks relief. When you heal, that need dissolves. You no longer pull energy from others to stabilize yourself. A healed person does not need to be central. They do not need to be indispensable. They do not need to be admired. Their presence is enough. Buddhism teaches that presence without demand is one of the most powerful forms of compassion. Choosing yourself is often misunderstood as turning inward and away. In reality, it clears the path outward. When your inner life is regulated, your attention is free. You can listen without agenda, respond without defense, act without compulsion. This freedom changes the quality of every interaction. A healed individual offers clarity, clarity in speech, clarity in boundaries, clarity in intention. This clarity reduces confusion around them. People know where they stand. There is less guessing, less tension, less emotional labor required to maintain connection. Obligation creates pressure. Pressure creates resentment. Resentment creates distance. Clarity dissolves this chain. Buddhism teaches that suffering multiplies through confusion. Reducing confusion is an act of kindness. When you choose yourself, you stop modeling self-abandonment. This matters more than advice ever could. Others feel permission to honor themselves when they see it embodied calmly and consistently. Buddhism understands the power of example. Teaching happens through being. A healed person does not rescue. They support. They do not fix. They accompany. This distinction matters. Rescuing keeps others dependent. Supporting respects autonomy. Buddhism teaches that compassion aims toward liberation, not reliance. Choosing yourself also removes hidden contracts from relationships. You no longer give with the hope of being chosen. You no longer stay with the expectation of being appreciated. You give because it aligns, not because it secures belonging. This honesty purifies connection. A healed individual can sit with discomfort without spreading it. When conflict arises, they do not escalate it to discharge anxiety. When sadness appears, they do not require others to carry it. Buddhism teaches that containing experience skillfully is part of wisdom. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means meeting it fully inside so it does not spill outward unconsciously. This containment creates safety. Others feel it even if they cannot name it. Choosing yourself also restores choice. You are no longer driven by fear or habit. You can choose when to engage and when to rest. This choice prevents burnout and resentment. Buddhism values choice rooted in awareness because it reduces harm. A healed person brings steadiness into groups. Their nervous system regulates others simply by being regulated itself. Modern science recognizes this. Buddhism has taught it for centuries. Inner peace is shared silently. Choosing yourself does not remove compassion, it refines it. Compassion becomes cleaner, less reactive, less entangled. You care without over-identifying. This allows compassion to last. There is also honesty in healed presence. You say yes when you mean yes, no when you mean no. This reliability builds trust. Buddhism teaches that trust reduces suffering because it removes uncertainty. A healed individual does not need to convince others of their goodness. They are not managing image. This absence of self-reference creates ease. Conversations become simpler. Relationships breathe. Choosing yourself also allows grief to complete. Unprocessed grief often seeks expression through others. Healed grief rests. It informs without demanding. Buddhism teaches that completed grief frees energy. When energy is free, creativity returns. You engage with life more playfully. This playfulness is not frivolous. It signals freedom from survival mode. Buddhism includes joy as part of awakening for this reason. A healed person does not create emotional debt. They do not give in ways that require repayment. They do not stay to avoid guilt. Their actions are voluntary. This voluntariness transforms community. Choosing yourself also means you no longer need to be right to feel safe. You can listen without defending. You can change your mind without collapsing. Buddhism teaches that flexibility is wisdom in motion. A healed individual can tolerate uncertainty. They do not rush to closure. They allow questions to remain open. This tolerance reduces pressure in relationships and decisions. When you choose yourself, you stop outsourcing meaning. You no longer require others to validate your existence. This independence is not isolation, it is grounding. Buddhism teaches that grounded individuals connect more deeply. A healed person also respects others' paths. They do not impose growth. They do not hurry healing. They trust timing. Buddhism teaches that forcing insight creates resistance. Choosing yourself frees others from managing you. They do not need to walk on eggshells. They do not need to perform emotional labor to keep you stable. This freedom is a gift. There is also dignity in healed presence. You stand without apology, not arrogantly, but quietly. Buddhism teaches that dignity arises when the self is no longer in conflict with itself. A healed individual does not create obligation because they are not seeking completion through others. They share from fullness. This fullness is not constant, but it is real enough to return to. Choosing yourself also changes how you engage with suffering in the world. You do not numb out, you do not over-identify, you respond where you can without collapsing. Buddhism teaches compassionate action rooted in equanimity. A healed person knows their limits. They do not promise what they cannot give. This honesty prevents harm. Buddhism teaches that unkept promises create suffering. Choosing yourself allows silence. You do not fill space to manage discomfort. You allow pauses. This quiet creates depth. Buddhism values silence because insight arises there. A healed individual brings less drama, not because life is dull, but because reactivity has decreased. This reduction of drama reduces suffering for everyone involved. Choosing yourself also ends cycles of overfunctioning. You stop compensating for others' lack of awareness. You let reality teach its own lessons. Buddhism teaches that allowing consequence is not cruelty, it is clarity. A healed person does not need to be special. They are content being human. This ordinariness is freeing. Buddhism teaches that awakening is found in ordinary experience when it is met fully. Choosing yourself also heals power dynamics. You no longer position yourself above or below. You meet others as equals. Buddhism teaches equality as a foundation for compassion. A healed individual can enjoy connection without clinging. They appreciate without fearing loss. This appreciation is lighter, it does not grasp. Buddhism teaches that non-clinging enhances joy. Choosing yourself is not the end of service, it is the end of self-erasure. Service that follows is sustainable, clear, honest. Buddhism teaches that sustainable compassion is true compassion. A healed person also models repair. When they make mistakes, they acknowledge them. They do not defend endlessly. This modeling teaches others how to be human without shame. Choosing yourself changes how you leave. You leave without burning bridges, without bitterness, without blame. Buddhism teaches that endings handled with awareness reduce future suffering. A healed individual becomes a source of clarity simply by being aligned. Their presence simplifies situations, reduces tension, opens space. This is not something they try to do. It is a natural effect. Choosing yourself is not a withdrawal from the world. It is a contribution to it. A quiet one, a deep one. One that does not demand recognition. When enough individuals choose themselves with awareness, systems soften, relationships stabilize, communities breathe. Buddhism teaches that collective suffering is reduced one mind at a time. This is the offering. Not perfection, not sacrifice, but presence without obligation, care without clinging, love without fear. And this is where the path does not end, but opens fully into life as it is, lived honestly, met directly, and shared freely. Choosing yourself was never about turning away from others. It was about turning back toward truth. Every layer you explored was not a rule to follow, but a veil to release. Letting go of self-abandonment, letting go of overgiving, letting go of endurance, guilt, fear, and the need to be needed. Each release was not loss, but return. Return to clarity, return to balance, return to a life that no longer requires you to disappear in order to belong. Buddhist wisdom does not ask you to become less human. It asks you to become more honest, to see where clinging created suffering, to see where silence replaced truth, and to understand that healing begins the moment you stop fighting your own inner knowing. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is how suffering stops spreading. It is how compassion becomes clean. It is how presence becomes an offering rather than a burden. If something in this journey spoke to you, leave a comment with the words, "I choose myself." Let it be a quiet commitment, not for others, but for you. And if this kind of wisdom helps you see life more clearly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. More reflections like this are waiting for you. Walk gently, stay honest, and remember, letting go is not the end of the path. It is the beginning of living it fully.